Hello everyone, and welcome back to Crime Whisper. I know so many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep, so before you drift off tonight, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying these cases, don't forget to like and subscribe now. Let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's story 1. Yulee, Nassau County, Florida. Tonight, we begin with the case of 34-year-old mother of 3, Jolene Jensen Cummings. Friends and family described Jolene as fun, social, kind, and loyal. The kind of person everyone loved to be around. She especially cherished her role as a mother, calling her children her proudest achievement after her first relationship ended. Jolene decided she needed a fresh start and began working at Tangle's hair salon in Yulee, Florida. She quickly settled in, building friendships with clients and co-workers. Her boss, Jim, described her as someone who could talk to anyone and make them feel at home. Jolene eventually remarried with her husband Jason Cummings. She had 2 sons, making her already busy life even more full. But in 2017, Jolene and Jason decided to separate and began working out a custody arrangement. She briefly dated another man, coincidentally also named Jason, but that relationship ended after several arguments. Despite the challenges in her personal life, Jolene pushed forward, focusing on her children and her career. She was determined to embrace a new chapter in life. May 12, 2018, it was a typical Saturday at Tangle's, Jolene's busiest day of the week. She was fully booked with clients and planned to clock out around 5 p.m. Excitedly, she was already looking forward to the next day, her birthday, which happened to fall on Mother's Day. She told friends she couldn't wait to spend time with her children, make a special gift for her mom, and enjoy a real family day. But the following morning, Jolene never showed up to meet her ex-husband, Jason C., to pick up the kids. At first, people thought she might have overslept, but by the next day, when there was still no sign of her, her family reported her missing. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Her bank account showed no activity. Even her SUV, a 2006 beige Ford Expedition, was gone. Her boss Jim was adamant something terrible had happened. Jolene loved her kids more than anything. He told investigators there's no chance she would disappear on her own. Her life was her children, and I refuse to believe she just took off. The first leads deputies began looking into the people closest to Jolene. Their first calls were to her ex-husband, Jason C., and her recent on-again, off-again boyfriend, Jason G. Jason C. immediately cooperated. Though he admitted things had been tense while navigating their split, he insisted that his children were his top priority. He offered access to his house, phone, and car, saying he had nothing to hide, with a strong alibi and no evidence against him. Police ruled him out quickly. Jason G., however, was a different story. Neighbor recalled hearing shouting and things breaking inside Jolene's home just 3 days before she went missing. Jolene was reportedly yelling at her kids to shut the bedroom door during the argument. Alarmed, a neighbor called police. By the time officers arrived, Jason G. had fled. When deputies finally tracked him down, they found him hiding under cardboard boxes inside a house. He was arrested on an outstanding warrant for probation violations. He admitted that he and Jolene had argued after he showed up uninvited, asking to stay. When she refused, he became aggressive and started breaking things. Police noticed scratches and marks on his arms. Jason claimed they came from playing with his dog. He allowed a search of his belongings and even said he'd take a polygraph test. But when investigators pressed him about where he had been the past few days, he said he'd lost his phone and couldn't provide an alibi. When it became clear how suspicious this looked, Jason G. lawyered up. He was officially labeled a person of interest. A break in the case for days. Investigators struggled with limited tips, leads were scarce, and the case seemed to stall. Then, on May 16, 2018, they caught a break. Jolene's SUV was found abandoned in a Home Depot parking lot just 2 miles from the salon. Surveillance footage showed the vehicle being parked around 1:15 a.m., hours after Jolene's last known shifted driver. Not Jolene's shadowy figure, dressed head to toe in black, was seen exiting the vehicle and running away, following security cameras from business to business. Detectives finally got a clear image: a woman, dressed in black, walking into a nearby gas station minutes later. She asked to borrow a phone to call a cab, and then left. Witnesses said the interaction felt strange, and investigators quickly realized this mystery woman had been the one driving Jolene's car. But if the intent was to steal the vehicle, why abandon it so close by? And what did this woman have to do with Jolene's disappearance? The mystery was just beginning. The mystery woman detectives reviewing the surveillance footage couldn't shake the question: who was this woman in black? Her behavior was strange. She had Jolene's car, parked it in the middle of the night, and then ran off to a gas station where she casually asked to use the phone. If she had stolen the SUV, why not keep it? Why leave it only a couple of miles away from Jolene's workplace? It wasn't long before investigators identified her. The woman was Jennifer Sibbert, or at least, that was the name she was using. She had recently started working alongside Jolene at Tangle's hair salon. To Jolene's friends and coworkers, Jennifer was a bit of a mystery. She kept to herself, never talked much about her personal life, and seemed to appear out of nowhere when she was hired. But when deputies started digging deeper into Jennifer Sibbert, they discovered something shocking. That wasn't her real name. At a hidden identity, Jennifer was actually Kimberly Kessler, a 50-year-old woman from Pennsylvania who had been using false identities for years. In fact, she had a long history of moving from place to place, working under aliases, and disappearing when people started asking too many questions. The revelation stunned investigators and raised even more red flags. Why would someone like this be driving Jolene's car in the dead of night? And what exactly was her connection to Jolene? When detectives searched the salon, they discovered surveillance footage from inside on the day Jolene vanished. She and Kessler were the last two people inside the building. Jolene was never seen, leaving suspicion. Gross investigators immediately brought Kessler in for questioning. She denied everything, insisting she knew nothing about Jolene's disappearance. But her story didn't line up. For starters, she claimed she hadn't been driving Jolene's SUV, despite the fact that multiple cameras showed her behind the wheel. She also denied any confrontation, though other employees recalled tension between her and Jolene in the weeks leading up to May 12th, when detectives searched Kessler's belongings. They made a disturbing discovery. She had been living out of her car, which contained wigs, disguises, and multiple forms of fake identification. It was clear she was someone who didn't want to be found. A disturbing discovery. As the investigation continued, detectives grew increasingly confident that Jolene had met with foul play and that Kessler was responsible. Though Jolene's body was never recovered, forensic teams combed through the salon and Kessler's car. They found traces of Jolene's blood in both places. Combined with the surveillance evidence, the abandoned SUV, and Kessler's suspicious behavior, investigators were convinced they had their suspect. Kessler was arrested and charged with murder. The trial, what followed, was one of the most bizarre trials Nassau County had ever seen. Throughout the proceedings, Kimberly Kessler acted erratically. She frequently interrupted the court, shouted at the judge, and even accused her own attorneys of conspiring against her. At one point, she was forcibly removed from the courtroom for her outburst, despite her attempts to derail the trial. The evidence was overwhelming. Prosecutors laid out the timeline. Kessler, harboring jealousy and resentment toward Jolene, had attacked her inside the salon, disposed of her body, and abandoned her SUV in an attempt to cover her tracks. After a lengthy process, the jury found her guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole. For Jolene's family, the verdict brought some measure of justice, but not closure. Her body has never been found, and her loved ones continue to live with unanswered questions. Her mother has spoken publicly about the pain of never being able to lay her daughter to rest. We know she's gone, but not knowing where she is, that's the hardest part. The case left a deep mark on the community of Tangle's hair salon, once a lively place full of laughter and conversation, became the backdrop of an unthinkable crime for friends and clients who knew Jolene. The memories are bittersweet, recalling her kindness, her love for her children, and the joy she brought to others. The gas station encounter when detectives tracked down the mysterious woman seen parking Jolene's SUV. They spoke with the gas station clerk, who had interacted with her that night. He recalled their conversation vividly. She came in, asked me to call her a taxi, and then we talked for a while. He explained she said she'd been out drinking with some friends. When one of their ex-boyfriends showed up and caused problems, she didn't go into much detail, but she kept rambling, mostly about meth and what it does to your body. Honestly, it was one of the weirdest conversations I've ever had. After about 10 or 15 minutes, a cab arrived, and she was gone, headed, she said, to a nearby Planet Fitness, a grim discovery. While investigators reviewed more surveillance, they also returned to Tangle's hair salon for a closer look under luminol testing. The truth was undeniable. The salon was a crime scene. Large pools of blood were found throughout the building. Attempts had been made to clean it up, but there was no hiding the evidence for investigators. The conclusion was now clear. Jolene had been killed inside the salon. This discovery allowed detectives to rule out Jolene's ex-boyfriend, Jason G., and dismiss theories of a random break-in. The evidence pointed directly back to one person: the new stylist who had been working alongside Jolene that day, Jennifer. Sibbert's suspicion falls on Jennifer. When detectives tried to speak with Jennifer, she wasn't at the salon, even though she was scheduled to open. Her boss, Jim, called her. Jennifer pulled into the parking lot, saw the police waiting, and immediately drove away. She called Jim back only to say she was quitting, demanding her final paycheck, and adding, "You'll never see me again." Detectives showed the salon staff the gas station footage, and every one of them recognized her immediately. "That's Jennifer," they said, though her hair looked slightly different. Jim handed over her supposed address, but it didn't exist. Jennifer wasn't answering her phone, had been the last person to see Jolene alive, had given out fake personal details, and was caught on camera driving Jolene's SUV. Pattern of odd behavior. Colleagues described Jennifer as difficult and unsettling. She often inserted herself into conversations, sometimes lashing out aggressively. One client remembered Jolene quietly washing her hair when Jennifer suddenly cut in, being unnecessarily rude and nasty for no reason. Others described her as crazy, paranoid, and a constant source of tension. One coworker even admitted, "She put everyone on edge. Honestly, I thought she had killed someone before and was on the run." Former employers painted a similar picture at one salon. Jennifer had once stormed out after bizarrely eating a pound of raw beef with her bare hands during a dispute over sliced lemons at another job. Coworkers said she was paranoid, prone to severe mood swings, and clearly had used false information to get hired to Jolene herself. Jennifer's behavior was no secret. Just days before her disappearance, Jolene told her bluntly, "Go away, I don't like you, you're crazy, you're fake." She even texted a friend to be on the lookout for Jennifer's car. Clearly sensing danger, Jennifer's disguise unravels. Investigators eventually found Jennifer miles away, living out of her car. At a gas station, she had visible injuries on her face and body. Consistent with being in a fight, she was arrested initially on an auto theft charge, but soon her entire identity unraveled. She wasn't Jennifer Siebert at all. She was Kimberly Kessler, a woman reported missing by her mother in Butler County, Pennsylvania, back in 2004 when fingerprint results came back. She admitted, "My name is Kimberly Lee Kessler. I was born May 9, 1968. I'm 50 years old. I've been living under this alias since 1999. You can call me Kim." Investigators quickly discovered she wasn't exaggerating. Kimberly had lived under at least 25 aliases, held 5 driver's licenses, and moved through 33 cities across 14 states. She used fake social security numbers, regularly altered her appearance with wigs and hair dye, and reinvented herself every time she moved. The name Jennifer Sibbert wasn't random either. Kessler admitted she had stolen it from the gravestone of a little girl who had died in a car. Accident layers of deception when, asked why she had spent nearly 2 decades running from her real name, Kimberly claimed it was to hide from an abusive ex. But her story raised more questions than it answered. Co-workers at Tangles recalled her often rambling about child services, court battles, and paranoia. That her ex-husband was trying to sabotage her. Some dismissed it as nonsense. Others thought it revealed just how unstable she was. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just a woman hiding from an old relationship. This was someone who had built an entire life out of lies, fueled by obsession and hostility. And now, she was at the center of a murder investigation, in denial. When investigators confronted Kimberly Kessler, she stuck to her story. She claimed she had no idea where Jolene was, and even denied stealing her SUV, despite clear surveillance footage proving otherwise at one point. She bizarrely accused Jolene of being a meth addict, something her friends and family immediately dismissed as absurd. Investigators did find a tiny bag near the back door of the salon, with trace amounts of what appeared to be meth. But no one believed it had anything to do with Jolene. Detectives tried to break through. They explained the charges. She was facing grand theft auto for abandoning Jolene's SUV, but nothing else. Yet something happened to Jolene. One investigator told her gently, "I don't think you're evil. I don't think you're a bad person. I think something happened that you didn't plan. I think it got out of control for a moment." It seemed Kimberly might open up, but as soon as the pressure mounted, she shut down, asking for a lawyer. A trail of evidence even without her cooperation. Investigators were piecing the puzzle together. CCTV footage showed her near the dumpsters, behind the salon on the day Jolene vanished, throwing heavy bags inside. They traced the trash collection route, which led to a massive landfill, containing nearly 4 million pounds of waste. Detectives knew the chances of recovering remains were slim to none. Near the dumpsters, they found the lid of a large plastic container. A search of Kimberly's real residence and a nearby storage unit uncovered even more disturbing evidence. Blood-stained items, confirmed through DNA testing to belong to Jolene's fingernail. Inside a container, a bag containing scissors, also covered in blood. Believed to be the murder weapon. Forensics showed that not only was Jolene's blood present, but traces of Kimberly's as well, suggesting a violent struggle. Disturbing clues. Kimberly's phone contained photos of a notebook filled with rambling lists. Some entries included names of people from her past, with words like Satan or evil scrawled beside them. She often wrote about demons, Jesus, and stalkers. Her internet search history included chilling phrases like "no body, no crime," and female serial killers. She had searched Jolene's name multiple times from her home. Investigators seized 6 wigs, several phones, and other items supporting her web of false identities. Interviews with people from her past painted a picture of someone volatile and frightening. An ex-boyfriend claimed she once told him, without hesitation, that she had shot her own cat with a shotgun as a child. She allegedly threatened to kill another child's brother with a baseball bat while he slept. The more investigators uncovered, the more they believed Jolene had been targeted by someone deeply unstable. Chilling purchases. Surveillance from a Walmart near the salon showed Kimberly shopping around 9 p.m. on May 12th. Roughly 4 hours after Jolene's last appointment, she purchased cleaning supplies, ammonia, zip ties, and an electric knife. Later that same night, around 11 p.m., she was caught again on camera, tossing heavy bags into the salon's dumpster. Detectives believed the horrifying truth was now clear. Jolene had been killed inside the salon, dismembered with the electric knife, and her remains discarded in trash. Bags that were hauled away to the landfill. Public announcement, May 22, 2018. Police held a press conference while we continue searching for Jolene. Evidence leads us to believe she is no longer alive. They confirmed. They also revealed that Jennifer Sibbert was in fact Kimberly Kessler, a woman with a long history of deception, for Jolene's mother. The news was crushing through tears. She begged the public. Sunday was a special day. Not only was it Mother's Day, but it was Jolene's birthday. She was born on Mother's Day. A gift from God. After I buried my first son, I beg you, as a mother, please keep coming forward with any information, no matter how small. My 3 grandchildren miss her so much. We want closure. Investigators believed Kimberly had carefully planned the murder, timing it for a weekend when the salon would be closed for 2 days. This would give her extra time to clean up and cover her tracks. Behind bars, Kessler was formally charged with first-degree murder, even in handcuffs. She seemed disturbingly at ease, smiling, chatting, even joking with officers, as though nothing had happened from jail. She continued her bizarre behavior. She often spoke to reporters and her mother by phone, denying everything, and at times almost reveling in the attention in one call. She said, "They keep me in solitary like it's punishment. But I love it. It's heaven. Girl, I'm on the front page of the paper, the talk of the town. If you ask me, it's the Illuminati. Her family must be connected. Nobody gets airtime like this, unless they're part of some secret society." Her delusional rambling only deepened the sense that this was not just a calculated killer, but someone consumed by paranoia and fantasy. Kimberly's spiral behind bars from the moment she was arrested. Kimberly Kessler insisted she was innocent in her mind. She was the victim of a conspiracy, a setup orchestrated to frame her for Jolene's disappearance in recorded jail calls. She ranted about insurance fraud, claiming someone was trying to collect on a policy they don't have anything on. "Me," she said, "it's all lies. They're just trying to steal from me. They even took the jewelry off my back, my rings, my bracelet gone confiscated, but never logged as evidence. Someone pocketed it there. Thieves." Her paranoia only deepened. She questioned whether her motorcycle and belongings were still in her storage unit. She accused deputies of robbing her. Nothing, in her view, was real. Kessler pleaded not guilty to murder, but as the state built its case, her behavior grew more erratic, irrational, and unpredictable. In jail, she refused food, fearing her meals were poisoned. Her weight plummeted from nearly 200 pounds to just 74. Guards reported that she often stripped naked, smeared feces across her cell window, and had to be restrained with pepper-sprayed. Doctors initially declared her mentally incompetent to stand trial, but later evaluations determined she did, in fact, understand the charges, and that her behavior was calculated. The sheriff put it bluntly. "She's not crazy, she's playing crazy. She always thinks she's the smartest person in the room." The trial. After months of delay, Kessler finally went to trial. By then, she was 53 years old, and determined to fight every step of the way. She refused to participate, often disrupting court proceedings. She wouldn't cooperate with her lawyers, insisting they were part of a conspiracy. "They appointed Jolene's cousin as my public defender," she shouted. "You don't want the public to know that, do you?" Her outbursts became so disruptive that she was eventually removed from the courtroom. Forced to watch the trial through a video link, the prosecution offered 2 possible motives. Exposure. Jolene had grown suspicious of Jennifer Sibbert and called her out for being fake, investigators believed. Kimberly feared her years of running and false identities were catching up to her jealousy. Kimberly resented Jolene's life, her close relationship with her clients, and the affection she received from others. That jealousy, prosecutors argued, turned to rage. The defense admitted there had been a violent confrontation, but argued the state had not proven premeditation, a requirement for first-degree murder, without Jolene's body. They said there was no definitive cause or time of death, but the jury saw through it. After deliberation, they returned with their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of grand theft. Otto Kimberly Kessler was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Aftermath for the jail staff who had endured her behavior. The transfer came as a relief. One officer called her evil in the flesh, saying, "We're fed up with her, she's the state's problem now." When word spread she was finally leaving, deputies celebrated with cake and ice cream, but for Jolene's family. The pain remained. Her mother pleaded once more for answers, from one mother to another. Please tell us where my daughter's remains are. Give us closure. Tragically, Bodhi has never been found. Tangle's hair salon, where she worked for years, closed permanently. The owner said it was simply too painful to carry on without her. Her 3 children were taken in by family. Her daughter now lives with her grandmother, while her 2 sons are cared for by their father, Jason. In interviews, Jason described Jolene as a devoted mother. She taught me how to be a great dad, he said. I make sure the kids talk about her all the time. When asked what he would say if he had one more chance to speak to her, Jason paused. I don't think you'd have enough film in that camera, he replied softly for Mother. Grief is a daily companion, yet she still feels her daughter's presence sometimes. I hear her say, Mom, do this hug the kids for me, kiss them for me. It brings a smile to my face and tears to my eyes. 411 days after Jolene was last seen, her family finally had justice, but closure remains. Elusive story 2. The Red Coat. December 22, 1978, Shakti, Rushaz. She waited for a ride home. Svetlana Gurkova noticed something unusual. Not far from her stood a young girl in a bright red coat. Beside her loomed a tall, middle-aged man, thin, bespectacled, dressed in a long black coat, carrying a shopping bag on the surface. There was nothing remarkable about him, but Svetlana couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He leaned down, whispering to the girl. His eyes locked on her with an intensity that didn't feel paternal. It didn't feel safe. Moments later, the man walked away. The girl followed. Svetlana's streetcar arrived, and she stepped aboard, not knowing she had just witnessed the beginning of a nightmare. The next morning, news spread quickly. The body of a young girl had been discovered in the nearby Bushveka River. Svetlana went straight to the police with what she had seen. The victim was identified as Nero. School the day before on that walk, she told a friend about a nice old man who had promised her imported chewing gum, a rare treasure in Soviet Russia. But this man had something much darker in store. He lured Yelena to a small, dilapidated house he referred to as his secret place. Once inside, he locked the door. Yelena was trapped. The man quickly overpowered her. Tearing away her coat and underwear, he smothered her screams with his arm across her throat, his weight crushing her small body until she could no longer fight back even after she went limp. He used her own scarf to blindfold her, then brutally assaulted her. When Yelena stirred, gasping for air, he pulled out a knife and stabbed her 3 times in the abdomen, carrying her lifeless body in his arms. He crossed the road to the riverbank. He tossed her and her belongings into the icy waters. Watching. December 22, 1978, Shakti, Soviet Union. And a cold evening, Svetlana Gurkova waited for her streetcar nearby. A young girl in a bright red coat stood with a tall man. He looked middle-aged, wore large glasses, and carried a shopping bag in one hand. His appearance was unremarkable, yet something about the way he leaned close, whispering to the child and staring intently at her, unsettled Svetlana. They didn't seem like family. They didn't seem like they even knew each other. Moments later, the man walked away. The girl followed. Svetlana's tram pulled up, and she stepped aboard, not realizing she had just witnessed the last moments of a little girl's freedom. The following day, news spread across the city. The body of a child had been found in the Grushevka River. Svetlana immediately went to police. She described what she had seen. A thin, bespectacled man in a long black coat, whispering to the girl. The victim was identified as 9-year-old Yelena Zakotnova, on her way home from school. She had told a friend about meeting a nice old man who promised her imported chewing gum. She walked with him to a dilapidated house, what he chillingly called his secret place. Inside, he locked the door. Yelena was trapped. He attacked quickly, stripping away her coat and underwear. When she tried to scream, he crushed her throat with his arm, smothering her beneath his weight. She stopped moving. Then, using her own scarf as a blindfold, he assaulted her. When she stirred again, struggling for breath, he pulled out a knife and stabbed her 3 times in the abdomen, carrying her lifeless body and belongings. He crossed to the riverbank, dropping her into the icy water and watching as she drifted downstream. But the killer made mistakes. He left the house light on, and blood dripped onto the doorstep 2 days later. Yelena's body was recovered. A sketch was drawn from Svetlana's description. That same night, police arrested a man named Alexander Kravchenko. He was just 25 years old, not middle-aged, and he didn't wear glasses, but his past made him an easy target. He had already served 6 years of a 10-year sentence for the rape and murder of a 17-year-old girl during questioning. Another lead surfaced. A local school principal thought the sketch resembled one of his teachers. A man named Andrei. Police visited houses near the river and found one in particular that matched a rundown home with its light still on. And blood on the front steps. Neighbors confirmed it belonged to Andrei. Chikatilo brought in for questioning. Chikatilo seemed nervous, but his wife quickly gave him an alibi, claiming he had been home all evening. The police released him with Chikatilo slipping through their fingers. Investigators turned back to Kravchenko under pressure. He confessed he was sentenced to 15 years in a labor camp, a punishment the public found too lenient. Outrage forced a retrial, and this time the sentence was death. Kravchenko was executed in the early 1980s day. Authorities congratulated themselves, another case solved, but they were wrong, horribly wrong. Not only had they executed an innocent man, they had let the real monster walk free by the time Kravchenko's life ended, before a firing squad. Andrei Chikatilo was already hunting again. His reign of terror was only just beginning. The investigation unravels. The investigation was crumbling. Local police were overwhelmed, incompetent, and unable to deal with what was clearly the work of one sadistic predator. The press would call him the Forest Strip Killer, a monster who preyed on the vulnerable. But within the Soviet Union, one phrase was never spoken: serial killer. The very idea was dismissed as a Western phenomenon, something that could never happen in the USSR. To admit such a killer existed would be to admit disorder, chaos, and weakness, and that illusion of control was something the Soviet regime was desperate to maintain still. Moscow knew something had to be done. Major Fedosov called in a respected forensic analyst, Dr. Viktor Burakov, to take charge of the investigation. Burak shifted focus. He studied sex offenders, ex-convicts, and men with psychiatric disorders, but the investigation was plagued by brutal, outdated methods. Suspects were beaten and coerced into confessions. Many of those confessions lead nowhere. The evidence, meanwhile, was piling up. Semen samples from multiple crime scenes suggested the killer had AB blood type. Gray hairs found on several victims matched. A task force was assembled, codenamed Operation Forest Strip. The pattern was clear. The killer prowled bus stops and train stations, luring women and children into the woods. Once there, he unleashed unspeakable violence, mutilation, dismemberment, even cannibalism. Victims were stabbed dozens of times, tongues cut out, nipples bitten off, eyes gouged out, internal organs removed. The sheer brutality left investigators baffled. Some whispered that gangs might be harvesting organs, others even suggested satanic cults. In desperation, police scoured psychiatric hospitals, searching for anyone whose past behavior resembled the horrors they were seeing. Anyone remotely suspicious was dragged in. Blood samples were taken. Then came a breakthrough. Or so it seemed. A man named Shabarov was picked up near a tram depot. Acting strangely, he had learning difficulties, but under pressure, he confessed to stealing a car with 4 other men. He went further, claiming they had killed children. All 5 were arrested under extreme interrogation. They confessed to multiple Forest Strip killings, but there was one glaring problem. None of their stories matched. They couldn't say where the murders had happened. They couldn't name victims. They couldn't even say how many had died. And still, the killings continued rather than admit failure. Investigators convinced themselves these men were part of a larger gang. More suspects with learning disabilities were rounded up. The brutal questioning drove one to suicide finally. Even the Soviet police could no longer deny the truth. They had the wrong men. They were released. The focus then shifted. This time, suspicion fell on Rostov's gay community, who were subjected to humiliation and abuse in a desperate hunt for the killer again. No evidence, no results. Next came another theory. Perhaps the murderer was a driver, someone with a vehicle, capable of covering vast distances quickly. Police interrogated every man with a license, more than 150,000 people. The effort nearly broke the department, and still nothing. Author Robert Cullen, a Moscow correspondent for Newsweek and later The New Yorker, wrote that Soviet law enforcement was crippled by bureaucracy. Local militia patrolled the streets, while federal procurators oversaw prosecutions in practice. The two agencies clashed constantly, tripping over one another and sabotaging progress. By now, the suspect index had grown to 15,000 names. Hundreds of officers were consumed by the case. The psychological toll was devastating. One investigator, exposed to the details of the killings for too long, began hallucinating that he himself was the murderer. Another lived in constant paranoia, convinced the killer was beside him in the street or sitting across from him on the bus. Meanwhile, the victims kept piling up. Mutilation and decomposition made identification nearly impossible. So in 1984, the police turned to an artist to sketch victims' faces. One was eventually identified as Ludmila Alexievand. Then August 28, 198,411-year-old Alexander Chappell went to the cinema in Rostov with a friend afterward. The two parted ways at a tram stop. Alexander waited for his ride home. He never made it. His body was discovered on the banks of the river by a man cutting hatha. Killing spree was accelerating. The profile and first encounter years had passed, and the investigation was still floundering. What did they truly know? Very little. The killer's semen samples suggested type AB blood, but so too did countless others. It narrowed nothing. By now, there had been 11 murders in a single summer, and police were no closer to catching him. Nearly 200,000 people had been blood-tested, tens of thousands of ex-convicts interrogated, and still nothing. Burakov realized the investigation was collapsing. Conventional methods had failed, so, in desperation, he turned to experts. The Soviet system traditionally shunned sexual pathologists and psychologists. Most refused to cooperate. After all, the USSR officially denied the existence of sexual deviance or psychopathy. But one man agreed. Dr. Alexander Buchanovsky, a brilliant psychiatrist, broke ranks and decided to help. He had almost nothing to work with, but within 10 days, he produced a psychological profile. The man they were hunting, he said, would be between 45 and 50 years old, a sexual sadist, someone who derived arousal from suffering and death. Buchanovsky concluded the killer was impotent, plagued by low self-esteem, and could only achieve gratification through violence. He would likely be educated, but socially isolated. A man with a history of sexual problems, unable to form lasting friendships. It wasn't much, but it was more than the police had ever had before. Suspicion at the station security was tightened at bus and train stations, especially in Rostov. The killer's last two victims had vanished. From their patrols were assigned, blending into the crowd, watching one officer. Inspector Alexander Zanisovsky was relentless. He believed killers always returned to their hunting grounds, day after day. He scanned the crowds until his eyes ached. Then, one afternoon, he noticed something. A middle-aged man with glasses, nervous pacing, approaching young girls. Whispering, Zanisovsky stepped in, asked for identification. The man stammered that he was a former teacher. Just bored, just passing the time. His papers revealed his name, Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo. He claimed he was returning from a business trip. What caught the officer's attention wasn't just his unease, but his occupation. Chikatilo worked as a freelancer for a KGB division, the Department of Internal Affairs. With no grounds to hold him, they had to let him go. But Zanisovsky couldn't shake the feeling something about Chikatilo was wrong. The second encounter weeks later, Zanisovsky saw him again, this time wearing a black fur hat. The same restless behavior, the same predatory glances. This time, Zanisovsky thought, "You won't get away from me." He and a colleague followed discreetly. Hiding behind a newspaper, tracking Chikatilo as he rode buses, got off, lingered, then boarded again. All day, they watched. He approached women and girls, trying to strike up conversations when rebuffed. He simply turned to another. Hours passed. At one point, he even dozed in a chair at Rostov station, unaware he was being shot. Later, they saw him put his arm around a young woman, sliding his hand under her shirt. She seemed intoxicated. Unresponsive. Minutes later, she snapped at him, pulled away, and left. That was enough. The officers moved in. "You've been under observation all day," they told him. "You're not free to go for the first time." Chikatilo's mask slipped. Sweat poured down his face in thick drops. His briefcase was searched inside. A knife, Vaseline, and rope. It was chilling, but under Soviet law, they could only hold him for 72 hours. Not enough. Desperate, they charged him with a minor offense, harassing women in public. It carried just 15 days in custody, but it bought them time. Dark past emerges. Investigators dug deeper into his past. What they found was damning. Chikatilo had once been a teacher, but a deeply troubled one. Students and staff alike considered him odd. Even frightening complaints mounted: inappropriate touching, sexual assaults, voyeurism. In 1974, he was expelled from one school at another. He oversaw a boys' dormitory. The students mocked him, ridiculed him. Then one night, he was caught attempting to assault a sleeping boy. Older students beat him for it afterward. He carried a knife for protection, but reports of his behavior never reached authorities. Schools covered it up to protect their reputations. The more police uncovered, the clearer the picture became. Stalking train corridors, ownership of a deserted riverside house, a history of deviance stretching back years. It looked like they had their man, but just as their hopes rose, it all came crashing down. The crucial mistake. Then came the crushing blow. When investigators tested Chikatilo's blood, it came back as type A, but the semen samples left at multiple murder scenes had been identified as type AB. The mismatch was fatal. The suspect they had in custody could not be the killer. It was a devastating mistake. Though Chikatilo was sentenced to a year in prison on unrelated charges, he served only 3 months. He was expelled from the Communist Party, but when he walked free, the police had no idea they had just released the monster they had been hunting. The explanation came later. Chikatilo was a non-secretor, meaning his blood type could not be detected in his bodily fluids. His blood was type A, but his semen was AB. Had investigators relied on hair, saliva, or semen samples, the match would have been made instead. They trusted faulty forensics. American forensic expert Edward Blake would later argue that Soviet mishandling of samples was likely to blame. Either way, the result was the same. The killer slipped through their fingers. Inspectors Anisovsky, convinced Chikatilo was their man, protested loudly, but his superiors dismissed his concerns. He was even demoted for being overzealous, and so, with the investigation in ruins, Chikatilo walked free, ready to kill again. A shifting Soviet Union, March 11th. 1985. The Soviet Union itself was changing within hours of leader Konstantin Chernenko's death. A new figure rose to power. Mikhail Gorbachev. With him came glasnost and perestroika, transparency, and restructuring. Moscow wanted reform, even in law enforcement. And so, the case was reassigned to the KGB's Department for Crimes of Special Importance. Isa Kostoyev took command. He restructured the congregation into 3 regional teams: Shakhty, Novoshakhtinsk, and Rostov. Every known sex offender was reviewed, whether in custody or not. Nightclubs and pornography outlets were even former police officers dismissed for misconduct came under suspicion. Undercover agents filled bus stations. Cameras were hidden in transport hubs. Female officers posed as vagrants, bait for the predator. The results were staggering. More than 200 rapists, sexual offenders, and even murderers were caught, but not the man they needed most, not Andrei Chikatilo. The killings continue. On August 1st, 1985. Chikatilo struck again while returning from a business trip to Moscow. He met 18-year-old Natalia Poklistova near Domodedovo Airport. She had learning difficulties. and when he offered her a walk, she accepted. 2 days later, her body was discovered, stripped, bound with rope, and stabbed 38 times. Just weeks later, on August 27th, he killed again. Irina Gulieva, another 81-year-old, was desperate for shelter. Chikatilo lured her into the woods, promising a place to stay in exchange for sex when he failed to perform. She laughed at him. He responded with a frenzy of stabbings. Her body was found the next day. Desperate for insight, Burakov turned to an unlikely source, Anatoly Slivko, a convicted serial killer awaiting execution. Slivko had tortured and murdered 7 boys from his cell. He explained how killers like him blended into society, hiding in plain sight. It was chilling advice, but it confirmed what Burakov already feared. Their quarry was still out there, and he was skilled at vanishing the predator among them. By late 1985, helicopters scanned forests and railway lines. Plainclothes officers flooded the countryside. Even civilians were enlisted into volunteer patrols, but no one realized the horrifying truth. The killer was among them. Chikatilo himself joined the volunteer groups, pretending to hunt for the murderer, while secretly studying police tactics. He simply shifted his crimes further afield. In Uzbekistan, 2 victims were butchered so brutally that investigators thought one had been mangled by farm machinery. On May 16, 1987, 13-year-old Oleg Makarenkov vanished from a railway station. He was later found murdered the following month. 12-year-old Ivan Bitskiv was discovered in woodland, stabbed so violently that the knife blade snapped inside him. His father found the body in September 1987. Chikatilo traveled to Leningrad. There, he lured 16-year-old Yuri Tereshonok from a train. His remains would not be recovered for years. Storm of blood. By 1988, despite the heavy police presence at transport hubs, the killings escalated over the next 2 years. 19 more victims would die this time. Chikatilo's focus shifted increasingly toward young boys, and with terrifying boldness, he began attacking in more public spaces, risking capture, but reveling in the danger. April 6, 1988. The disfigured body of an unidentified woman, aged 22 to 28, was found in a vacant lot near a metals factory. In the following year, Chikatilo killed 8 times. One murder even took place in his daughter's apartment in February 28, 1989. He stabbed and dismembered 16-year-old Tatiana Razova. To dispose of the body, he wrapped the remains, tied them to a sled, and dragged them through the streets under the cover of night. Just months later, in May, he struck again, murdering Alexander Dyashchenko. The day after the boy's 8th birthday, his remains were discovered weeks later by a taxi driver, and still, the bodies kept coming. The final murders on June 20th, 1989. Chikatilo abducted a boy from a beach and dragged him into nearby woodland, where he was murdered. Less than a month later, he struck a Ganat, a bus stop. 19-year-old Yelena Varga sat waiting. Chikatilo offered to walk her home, and she accepted instead. He led her into the forest, stabbing her repeatedly before mutilating her body, cutting out her uterus and disfiguring her face. He wrapped her corpse in her own clothing and, without pause, went straight to his father's birthday party. Soon after, 10-year-old Alexei Kobatov vanished outside a cinema. He was buried in a shallow grave in a Rostov cemetery. The killings accelerated. January 14, 1990. 11-year-old Andrei Kravchenko was snatched from the streets of Shakhty. His body was discovered a month later, March 7th. 13-year-old Yaroslav skipping school, wandered into the botanical gardens. Chikatilo murdered and mutilated him. His remains were found the next day. April, 31-year-old Labov disappeared en route to Shakhty. Her skeletal remains surfaced months later. July 28. 13-year-old Viktor Petrov was taken from a bus stop. His body was later found in the same botanical gardens as Yaroslav Soga's 17th. 11-year-old Ivan Fomin was lured from a municipal beach. He was stabbed 42 times and savagely mutilated by autumn. The frenzy showed no signs of slowing on. October 17th, 16-year-old Vadim Gromov, a student with learning difficulties, vanished after riding a train weeks later. Chikatilo killed again. 16-year-old Viktor Tishenko. Viktor resisted, fighting back fiercely. He even bit Chikatilo and broke his finger that night. There had been no police patrols at the station. The first lapse in months witnesses recalled seeing Viktor buy a ticket accompanied by a tall man with glasses and gray hair. One woman even recognized him as the same man she had seen the year before, pestering a boy on a train. The boy had escaped, but the description matched. The police interviewed her daughter, who gave a detailed account. The man she described, always haunting train stations, always trying to approach children, matched one name already buried in their files: Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo. Closing in on November 6, 1990. Chikatilo claimed his final known victim, 22-year-old Svetlana Korostik, a homeless woman, was found in the forest a week later. Her nipples had been bitten off and her body smeared with dirt. Unknowingly, Sergeant Igor Rybakov had encountered the killer just hours after the murder. He noticed a tall, sweaty man with glasses stumbling from the woods, his finger bandaged, blood on his ear and cheek. Rybakov stopped him and asked for papers. The man complied. Moments later, a train arrived. Seeing no reason to hold him, the sergeant let him board. Days later, when Svetlana's mutilated body was discovered, Rybakov remembered the encounter. He filed his report, and the name on those papers stood out: Andrei Chikatilo. Investigators cross-checked his work records on May 14, 1988. One of the victims had been killed in Shakti. Chikatilo's job records showed he had been there that same day. Piece by piece, the puzzle began to align: his appearance, his history of sexual abuse allegations, his strange behavior at stations. The noose was tightening. The arrest on November 20, 1990. Chikatilo went to get his injured finger x-rayed, broken weeks earlier by Viktor Tishenko. Later, while buying beer, he attempted to strike up conversations with several boys. Each time, protective mothers intervened. Then three officers approached. Chikatilo was carrying his briefcase. Inside, as before, were the tools of his trade: a knife, rope, and Vaseline. The arrest was captured on film for the second time in his life. Andrei Chikatilo was in custody this time. He would not walk free. The dark past back at headquarters. Officers raided his home. What they found was damning: more than 20 knives, a hammer, and shoes that matched bloody footprints from one murder. As investigators processed him, one chilling fact emerged: Dr. Buchanovsky's psychological profile, once dismissed, had been hauntingly accurate. Chikatilo was 54, impotent, isolated, accused of sexual misconduct, with almost no friends. He was the killer described years earlier, hiding in plain sight. But to understand the monster, one had to return to where it began. October 16th, 1936, in a tiny Ukrainian village ravaged by famine, Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was born. His childhood unfolded under the shadow of Stalin's brutal collectivization policies and the horrors of the Second World War. His father, Roman, was drafted into the Red Army, captured by the Nazis, and returned home shamed as a prisoner. The stigma marked the family, and Andrei endured merciless bullying. His mother, trapped in poverty and hardship, raised him and his sister in a one-room hut. Rumors swirled that she had been raped by a German soldier, and some suggested the young boy may even have witnessed it. Andrei grew up withdrawn, bookish, and deeply insecure. Even as a child, he carried the scars of humiliation, hunger, and trauma, scars that would one day erupt in the most grotesque fashion imaginable. The breakthrough on December 5, 1990. After days of psychological maneuvering, Andrei Chikatilo finally confessed. Once the dam broke, the words poured out of him in chilling, matter-of-fact detail. He described the murders, one by one, each victim, each method, each place where he had disposed of their bodies. Investigators sat in stunned silence as the count grew. Not 5 victims, not 10 but 53, spoke of boys and girls, women and teenagers, victims stabbed, strangled, mutilated. He described how he couldn't perform sexually, but how the act of stabbing itself brought him to climax for him. The knife was a substitute for power, for masculinity, for everything. He lacked us. He relived the killings. Chikatilo seemed almost relieved for years. He had lived in constant fear of exposure now. With the weight lifted, he was animated, even eager, as though finally someone was listening to his story, the reconstruction over the following weeks. Police escorted him back to crime scenes across Rostov Oblast at each site. He retraced his steps with unnerving precision, where he met the victim, how he lured them, where he struck the first blow, and how he disposed of the body. Investigators were astonished at sights long forgotten. Chikatilo remembered the smallest details, the angle of a tree, the location of discarded clothing, the spot where he had buried a body. He even led them to remains they had never found. The monster of Rostov was now his own tour guide. Crowds of onlookers gathered, hurling insults and curses as police paraded him through the forests and train stations where he had once hunted. Some tried to attack him, screaming for vengeance. Others simply stared, unable to comprehend the scale of the evil standing before them. Trial of the century. In April 1992, after 2 years of preparation, the trial of Andrei Chikatilo began. It was the most sensational trial in Soviet and later Russian history. He was accused of 53 murders. The courtroom was packed with grieving families, journalists, and ordinary citizens desperate to see justice. When proceedings opened, Chikatilo's behavior was bizarre. He often ranted, shouted, and exposed himself at one point. He even sang. His antics were so extreme that he was confined to an iron cage, a sight that became one of the most infamous images of the case. The defense argued insanity, but psychiatrists, including Dr. Buchanovsky, testified that while Chikatilo had severe psychological disorders, he was fully aware of his actions and understood they were wrong. He was not insane. He was calculating, controlled, and responsible. Verdict. On October 15, 1992, after months of testimony, the verdict was delivered. The judge declared, Andrei Chikatilo, you are found guilty of 52 counts of murder and 5 counts of sexual assault. He was sentenced to death by firing squad. Families of the victims erupted in applause. Some wept, others shouted for his immediate execution. After more than a decade of terror, the nightmare was finally ending. The end. Chikatilo spent the next 2 years in solitary confinement. He wrote letters, rambled about his life, and even complained about his treatment in prison. But justice was inevitably. February 14, 1994, at a prison in Novocherkassk, Andrei Chikatilo was led into a soundproofed room. He was ordered to kneel without ceremony, without delay. An executioner raised his pistol and fired a single shot into the back of his head. The monster of Rostov was dead. Legacy of horror in total. 52 lives were proven lost to Chikatilo, though some investigators believe the true number may be even higher. The case exposed the failings of Soviet law enforcement, wrongful arrests, botched investigations, and the execution of at least one innocent man. It revealed how bureaucracy, secrecy, and pride had allowed a killer to operate unchecked for over a decade. But more than anything, it left scars on the families of the victims' children, sisters, daughters, sons, lives stolen by a man who saw their suffering as his only path to pleasure. Andrei Chikatilo remains one of history's most infamous serial killers. His name is etched forever into the dark annals of human depravity. The confession on December 6, 1990. Inside a small interrogation room in Rostov, Andrei Chikatilo finally broke. For days, detectives had pressed him, and then, as though a dam had burst, the words began to spill out. He had been accused of 36 murders, but Chikatilo shook his head. No, he said, that is wrong. And then he confessed to 56 for 12 long years. He had stalked bus stops, train stations, lonely paths, and forest strips. Now, he spoke with cold precision about every victim, every lure, every mutilation. He described how he offered food to children, or promised a shortcut to women, or dangled the allure of Western chewing gum or illicit films to young boys. They were everywhere. He told investigators at every stop, I didn't even have to search once. Inside the woods, the fever took hold. His body shook, his breathing quickened, and the violence poured out of him with each strike of the knife, each scream silenced. He felt the only kind of release he was capable of when Andrei Chikatilo finally faced justice. The courtroom was suffocating with tension. Judge Leonid Akubzanov required 2 full days to read through more than 200 case files. The charges were so grotesque that some listeners fainted. Even seasoned guards, hardened by years of service, were overwhelmed and had to sit down when the charges were complete. Chikatilo was given the floor for nearly 2 hours. He rambled in self-pity, painting himself as a man persecuted since childhood, mocked for his impotence, burdened by failures at work, and cheated out of the political career he once dreamed of. But his bizarre theatrics only deepened the horror he sang, muttered nonsense, and at one point even dropped his trousers, exposing himself to the court. Many believed he was attempting to appear in Senna. Judge pressed him relentlessly. "Don't you imagine the agony when you bit off their tongues? I've seen hundreds of corpses," he said, "but nothing like this for 1 minute of pleasure. You demanded the life of a child, didn't you think of that?" Chikatilo only mumbled, "I can't explain," from the gallery. Victims' families erupted. One grieving mother called him an evil sadist. Another, whose 10-year-old son Alexei had been slaughtered, cried that she hoped Chikatilo would die in agony. Others shouted that they wished they could tear him apart with their own hands. Nurses circulated with valerian drops to calm those overcome by rage and grief. The court heard how Chikatilo had deliberately chosen society's most vulnerable: the poor, runaways, orphans, women with disabilities, and children desperate for kindness. His methods were simple: promises of food, money, chewing gum, or a shortcut to the train station. He lured them into the woods, where his feverish violence consumed him. "I used my knife for relief," Chikatilo admitted. "I know I have to be destroyed. I was a mistake of nature." Dr. Buchanovsky, the psychiatrist who had profiled him, explained that Chikatilo did not feel true remorse, only regret for himself. He described himself as a wolf, a beast incapable of restraint. Court sessions were chaotic. Chikatilo constantly disrupted proceedings, shouting nonsense or exploding into tantrums. At one point, a man in the gallery hurled a metal bar at his cage, narrowly missing his head for much of the trial. He was removed so evidence could be presented without interruption. The proceedings dragged on for months. Finally, in October 1992, Judge Akubzanov delivered his verdict. His voice cracked with emotion as he read from a 330-page judgment that not only condemned Chikatilo, but also criticized the police for years of incompetence that allowed the killer to roam free. Chikatilo was convicted of 52 of the 53 charges of murder. His victims included 21 boys aged 8 to 16, 14 girls aged 9 to 17, and 17 women murdered between 1978 and 1990 across Russia, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan. Each guilty count carried its own death sentence. As the verdict was read, the courtroom exploded in applause from his cage. Chikatilo screamed defiance. "Why me? I demand a lawyer. Show me the corpses." He kicked over his bench and called the judge a fraud before being dragged away awaiting death on death row. Chikatilo remained unrepentant in interviews. He sneered that he was nothing but an actor playing a role worthy of an Oscar. "They've written a script for me," he complained. "They paint me as a beast." That's all. His final appeals reached the desk of President Boris Yeltsin, but each was rejected. The sentence was final on February 14, 1994. Prison guards entered his cell. Chikatilo was led down a narrow corridor, his last walk in a small chamber. He was forced to his knees. A single bullet to the back of the head ended the life of the man who had terrorized Russia for over a decade. Aftermath: his wife and children quietly changed their names and disappeared from public life, burdened by the shame of his crimes. Investigators, however, carried forward the lessons. Dr. Alexander Buchanovsky's psychiatric profiling methods became the foundation of Russia's new killer department, dedicated to tracking serial predators in the years that followed. Books, films and documentaries, would revisit the horrors of the Rostov Ripper, most notably. The 1995 HBO film Citizen X dramatized the investigation, ensuring that Chikatilo's name and the trail of devastation he left behind would never be forgotten but for the families who had lost children, siblings, and loved ones. No trial, no execution, and no film could ever bring peace. Andrei Chikatilo remains one of the most infamous serial killers in history, a chilling reminder of how long evil can hide in plain sight when denial, incompetence, and fear keep a society blind. Story 3. The Murder of Craig Rideout. Rochester, New York, July 2016. In the quiet, tree-lined village of Pittsford lived the Rideout family. 50-year-old Craig Rideout was an IT specialist and programmer, a man who friends and family described as dedicated, intelligent, and above all, family-oriented. He lived with his wife, Laura, and their 7 children: Colin, Andrew, Alexander, Elizabeth, Julia, Patrick, and Melon. Craig and Laura had married in 1993. From the beginning, they dreamed of a big, bustling household, and before long, their wish came true. Craig's sister Robin often said that family was everything to her brother. He was deeply involved in his children's lives, frequently volunteering with youth groups, organizing charity events, and even sharing his love for gaming with them. But raising 7 children came with enormous financial strain. Craig worked long hours, often away from home. His sister later recalled how Craig worried constantly about money, while Laura appeared more carefree. Tension built as bankruptcy loomed, and eventually, the Rideouts were forced to downsize. The financial struggles only deepened. Cracks in the marriage. Laura grew increasingly distant from Craig and even from his side of the family. She and the children stopped attending holiday gatherings when Robin asked why. One child would say, "Mom's not feeling well." Another would whisper the truth: "She just didn't want to come." By 2014, Laura had filed for divorce around the same time. She grew close to a family friend, Paul, PJ Tucci, a man Craig had known since college. Their families had always been intertwined. The children had grown up together, and Craig had even named PJ, the godfather of his eldest son, Colin, after PJ's wife passed away. Laura moved in with him. 2 outsiders. It looked like a betrayal to Craig. It was devastating. He still wanted Laura to be happy, but seeing her with his longtime friend was a wound that never closed as divorce proceedings dragged on. Custody battles followed. Craig was awarded primary custody of 4 of the younger children: Patrick, Malene, Elizabeth, and Julia. The 3 eldest, Colin, Andrew, and Alex, were free to choose. Colin and Alex sided with their mother, moving in with Laura, and PJ. Craig tried to rebuild bridges with his older children, but the distance grew. He was blindsided when Alex posted a scathing message on Facebook, calling his father a coward and emotionally abusive. Robin, stunned, called Craig. Immediately, she said, her brother was devoted, gentle, and would never intentionally harm his children. She wanted to defend him online, but Craig begged her not to leave it. He said, "I don't want a public fight." The intrusion on the night of July 13, 2016. Craig was woken abruptly. An intruder dressed in black burst into his bedroom. The figure yanked a few hairs from Craig's arm, grabbed his BlackBerry phone, and fled later. Craig found his keys discarded in a flower pot outside. At first, he wondered if it had been a bizarre pranked by his son Colin, but when he received a scathing email from Colin soon after, that thought disappeared. The email was cold, angry, and addressed him not as dad, but Craig. Colin accused him of dragging out the divorce to hurt Laura, of faking the break-in at his house, and of blaming his children for what he called heinous deeds. Craig, exhausted from years of conflict, fired back with frustration. Why, he asked, couldn't Colin simply reach out to him like a son instead of ignoring him for months and then attacking him by email? Behind the scenes, Craig had already been complaining to his attorney about Laura's erratic behavior, missed pickups, last-minute changes, and even abandoning all the children on his doorstep without warning. He felt Laura was actively turning The children against him. Robin believed him. She insisted there was no way. Craig would have been awarded custody if the allegations of abuse were true, but the strain was visible. Craig leaned heavily on Robin, calling her daily for advice and support. The disappearance on the morning of July 19th. Robin sensed something was terribly wrong for once. Craig had gone silent. No texts, no emails, no calls. Repeated attempts to reach him went unanswered. Worried, she called his workplace, only to be told that Craig had emailed the night before, saying his daughter was sick and he'd be unavailable. But that didn't sound like him. Robin drove straight to Craig's house. His minivan was gone. Peering through a window, she saw someone inside. It was Laura. Laura told Robin she'd come over because the children said Craig wasn't home when they woke up. She claimed she had stayed to tidy the kitchen, which smelled funny. Robin, uneasy, looked around. Craig's shoes were neatly lined by the door. His jackets hung untouched. His personal belongings were still in place. Her panic deepened. She called 911. My brother hasn't answered texts, phone calls, or emails, she said. I could be overreacting, but something's wrong. The search police obtained a warrant and filed a missing persons report. They spoke to Laura and the two youngest children, Malene and Patrick. Obviously, you're concerned about him, one officer said gently. I don't even know what to think, Laura replied. The children's answers raised more questions. The last time I saw him, Patrick said, he was playing video games on the computer. He went to the bathroom, then downstairs that night. He was still downstairs. Then he was gone in the morning, another child added. I saw him at 11:30 last night. He was going to bed by morning. Craig had vanished. The house showed no signs of forced entry. No valuables were missing. It was as though Craig had simply walked out the door and disappeared into the night. The basement discovery downstairs in Craig Rideout's basement. Investigators noticed something unsettling. Unlike the tidy upper floors, the basement was cluttered with storage boxes and bins. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual, but when they looked closer, faint red stains appeared on the boxes and a trash bag. They found something horrifying, a handmade garrote, smeared with blood. Other bags contained leather work gloves, also stained when luminol was sprayed across the concrete. The scene lit up. Blood was everywhere on the floor, on the walls, and it looked recent. Everything was collected and sent for testing at the same time. Detectives turned to Craig's phone. It was still ringing when dialed, meaning it was powered on. Tracking data revealed its last location, not in Pittsford, but 50 miles away, and at that very location, another investigation was already underway. The body in the woods at 7:53 a.m. on July 20th. Police received a disturbing call. We discovered a body in the woods, under a tarp. Officers arrived at a rural roadside. A shovel lay discarded nearby, and a trail of blood led into the trees beneath. A brown tarp. They saw a human foot. Paramedics confirmed there was nothing they could do. The man was dead. And then, from under the tarp, investigators heard a buzzing sound. It was a phone, still receiving calls. The caller ID read Robin Drew, Craig's sister. Although dental records were required for confirmation, detectives already knew the body was Craig. Rideout. The medical examiner's report was grim. Craig had suffered massive blunt force trauma to his head and neck. With multiple facial fractures around his neck was a deep groove, evidence of strangulation with a device. But what shocked investigators most was the condition of his body. A powerful acid had been poured over him, eating through fabric, burning skin, and even exposing bone. White plastic bottle caps were found with the tarp, likely from the very acid used. The conclusion was clear. Craig had been killed in his home, then transported and dumped in Yates County. Strange calm that same evening. Robin remained at Craig's house when Laura and Paul Tucci arrived with the youngest children. Laura casually asked detectives if Craig had been found. She admitted she'd cleaned the house earlier, but insisted she knew nothing of his whereabouts. Her calmness was unnerving. Detectives noted how unaffected she seemed. Rabin reminded police about a hidden camera Craig kept in the kitchen, disguised as a digital alarm clock, pointed directly at the walkway. Investigators recovered the footage. but it yielded nothing. The camera had filled its memory and stopped recording days earlier. A promising lead had gone cold now. With a crime scene in one county and a body in another, investigators were stretched thin, but within 24 hours, they would receive a break from a place chillingly known as Devil's Bathtub. Caught at Devil's Bathtub on July 21st, a dog walker at Minden Ponds Park called police after spotting two young men suspiciously tossing garbage bags into a pond. Officers responded quickly and apprehended the pair. They were Craig's sons, Colin and Alexander. Right out when questioned, the brothers tried to downplay the situation. Colin said nervously, "We were just out walking. I've never really dealt with police before. I don't drink. I don't do drugs. I'm 19, starting college next year." Alex echoed his brother, claiming he had no idea what was in the bags, but when detectives opened them, the truth spilled out. Paper towels soaked in blood, bloody clothing and shoes, and bottles of industrial drain cleaner, the same kind found with Craig's body. Pressed further, Colin admitted their mother, Laura, had told them to dump the bags. "It was just something Mom asked us to do," he said. Alex went further, confessing he'd seen blood in the basement. Closing in pleas. Used a clever tactic. They bought the brothers food at a fast food chain, planning to collect DNA from their straws. Then, both Colin and Alex were arrested for tampering with evidence. Detectives wasted no time. They headed straight to Laura and Paul's house. Laura seemed almost amused when officers told her she was under arrest. "If I'd known you were coming," she quipped, "I would have put on some makeup and heels." A search of the house revealed more damning evidence. A spare key fob for Craig's car, and rolls of blue tape identical to that used on the homemade garage. For now, Laura, Paul, and the two brothers faced charges of evidence tampering, but investigators knew they were closing in on something far bigger. A father of 7 was dead, his estranged wife, her lover, and 2 of his children were implicated in covering up the crime. Only question left was, who actually killed Craig? Rideout. Charges in community shock at first. Laura Rideout and her sons Colin and Alexander were charged only with tampering with evidence. Police emphasized this was an active investigation and hinted that murder charges were likely on the horizon for neighbors in the quiet Pittsford townhouse community. The revelation was both a relief and a heartbreak. Relief because the killing wasn't random, heartbreak because it meant the horror had come from within a family. One resident summed it up. "It doesn't make it any less terrifying to think a neighbor could kill. It's unfathomable." Meanwhile, the case drew comparisons to another high-profile local tragedy, the Charlie Tan case. As with Tan, supporters quickly rallied. A GoFundMe page for Colin and Alex raised over $3,000 in just 5 hours, with a stated goal of $55,000. But while public opinion swirled, the investigation pressed forward. Confirmation and the search for evidence. Days later, the medical examiner confirmed what investigators already knew. The body in Yates County was indeed Craig. Rideout Sheriff Spike formally announced the joint investigation between Yates County, Monroe County, and the New York State Police. Now, with the suspects out on bail, detectives needed to connect them directly to Craig's death and to the dumping of his body. They returned to Craig's phone records. Data showed the device leaving his home around 3 a.m. on July 19th, the same time investigators believed the body was moved from there. A route was plotted between Pittsford and Jerusalem, the town where the body had been dumped. Investigators requested security footage from businesses and traffic cameras along that path. Cameras, cars, and convoys. One crucial video came from a hotel roughly halfway along the route. Around 3:30 a.m., 2 vehicles sped past the camera, one after the other. Craig's phone data matched their movement, though the footage was grainy. Investigators believed one was a dark sedan, the other a white minivan, consistent with Craig's van. Fast forwarding, they spotted the same vehicles traveling back together later that morning, this time in convoy, caught on 6 separate cameras. It was a clear sign that multiple people were involved. Craig's minivan was later discovered abandoned in a park-and-ride lot. Unfortunately, No cameras covered that section of the lot, leaving unanswered questions about who had left it. There, the Walmart trail. The next breakthrough came through receipts and card records. Detectives traced 3 separate Walmart trips in the 24 hours surrounding Craig's death. In the first trip, surveillance showed Colin exiting a sedan and purchasing a shovel and 4 pairs of work gloves. Camera enhancements revealed at least 3 other people in the vehicle, though the images were too blurred to identify them. A second Walmart purchase included several bottles of industrial drain cleaner. This time, Laura was caught on camera entering the store with Colin and one of her daughters. Colin again made the purchase. The third and most damning trip happened at 9 p.m. on July 19th. Just hours before the killing, Laura Rideout was seen entering with Paul Tucci. Together, they purchased a brown tarp, more drain cleaner, bungee cords, and a bottle of Coke. Every item matched the tools and materials used in Craig's murder and the disposal of his body. DNA evidence lab results confirmed the suspicions. The clothing pulled from Devil's bathtub matched what Colin wore in the Walmart footage. Alexander's DNA was found on evidence recovered from Craig's basement. Laura's trousers from the tarp purchase were also found among the dumped bags, with traces of Craig's blood and a Diet Coke bottle discovered in the basement carried Laura's DNA step by step. The forensic trail was closing in, linking Laura, Paul, and her sons not just to a cover-up, but to the murder itself. The indictments. Though Paul Tucci's Walmart clothes were never found, his DNA turned up on items recovered from the pond. That was enough for prosecutors. Laura Rideout, her boyfriend Paul Tucci, and her sons Colin and Alexander were all charged with second-degree murder and tampering with evidence. Each pleaded not guilty, but investigators soon discovered even darker secrets during a search of Paul's home. His 19-year-old son, Theodore Tucci, was arrested on unrelated charges, possession of child abuse material. For detectives, the motive behind Craig Rideout's killing came into sharper focus. At the center was a bitter custody dispute and Laura's obsession with control. Just weeks before Craig's death, Laura and Paul had signed a lease in North Carolina. She wanted her children to come with her. Craig refused. That refusal, police believed, set the murder plot in motion. The failed setup in the days leading up to the murder, Laura tried to manipulate her children into provoking Craig. Text messages between her and Colin revealed a disturbing plan. If the kids could get Craig angry enough, Laura could call police and build a case for custody. Colin even texted one sister, telling her exactly what to say to 911 dispatchers. "He's trying to break down the door, and I'm afraid he's going to kill my sister." But Craig never reacted. The plan fell apart. Laura, frustrated, texted Colin that Julia had messed everything up and needed to be dealt with. Colin replied coldly, "Turn off Julia's phone right now. She'll break in 48 hours to Craig's family." It was clear Laura had poisoned the minds of her children, creating a toxic atmosphere that spiraled into tragedy. One trial for defendants in a highly unusual move. Prosecutors decided to try all 4 defendants together in one courtroom from the start. Their defense strategies turned inward. Laura's attorneys pointed to Colin. Colin's attorneys blamed Laura. Paul's team argued there was no evidence tying him to the actual killing, and Alexander's lawyers insisted he was guilty only of helping. After the fact, the truth of who delivered the fatal blow was unclear, but prosecutors believed they had enough. A mountain of physical evidence, DNA, and a trail of purchases that told the story of a conspiracy. The prosecution's theory: during the 5-week trial, more than 50 witnesses testified, and nearly 700 pieces of evidence were introduced. The state's theory was chilling. On the night of July 19th, Craig returned home after dropping off his youngest children. Laura lured him into the basement under the pretense of discussing the move inside. Colin, Alexander, and Paul, who had their own keys, were already waiting. Craig fought back, but was struck in the face and strangled before he could escape. His killers then wrapped his body in a tarp, loaded it into his own minivan, and drove through the night to a remote patch of Yates County, where they dumped him. Verdicts. Closing arguments took place on the 1-year anniversary of Craig's murder. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom after 5 days of deliberation. The jury delivered its verdicts. Alexander Rideout, not guilty of murder, guilty of 2 counts of tampering with evidence, sentenced to 2 to 8 years. Colin Rideout, guilty of second-degree murder and 2 counts of tampering with evidence, sentenced to 28 years to life. He will be eligible for parole in 2043. At age 50, Laura Rideout, guilty of second-degree murder, burglary, and tampering with evidence, sentenced to 28 years to life. She will be eligible for parole in 2055. At age 83, Paul Tucci, acquitted on all charges. The judge ordered his record sealed aftermath as the sentences were read. The judge condemned the crime as a premeditated evil and diabolical scheme. Craig's family sat in stunned silence. They had endured a year of rumors, accusations, and attempts to tarnish Craig's name. Now, at last, there was a measure of justice. But the horror remained. A husband and father had been brutally murdered, not by a stranger, but by the people closest to him and for the community of Pittsford. The Rideout case stood as a chilling reminder. Sometimes the greatest danger is not outside the home, but within its courtroom. Shocked during the trial, testimony and bloodspatter evidence placed both Colin Rideout and Laura Rideout in Craig's basement at the time of his murder. Colin was also tied to Devil's Bathtub, where evidence linked to Craig's body had been discarded. The judge, visibly shaken, told the court, "This is one of the ugliest cases I have ever seen." With that, the gavel came down. Court was in recess for Craig's family. The verdicts landed like a gut punch. A family shattered. Craig's mother, Agnes, struggled to comprehend the betrayal. "People ask me, how does a mother convince her children to kill their father? My belief is that it starts with a small lie, then you begin to believe it. Eventually, you tell it to your children." Robin, Craig's sister, reflected on the tragic arc of her brother's life. "I stood at his wedding in 1993. One of the happiest days of his life. He was young, in love, starting a family. 23 years later, I found myself watching his wife convicted of his murder. Worse, their children were complicit, and now, our family has lost Craig and 2 of his children to prison." The Rideouts not only lost a son and brother, but also contact with most of Craig's children, who had been deeply influenced by Laura. Lingering suspicions even after the trial. Investigators remained convinced that Paul Tucci played a larger role. They believed he was the one who struck Craig in the face, and that his size made him critical in moving Craig's body. Paul, however, maintained his innocence. He gave interviews, appeared in a documentary, and later moved out of Western New York. Despite everything, he continued visiting Laura in prison. "I'll never turn my back on her or those kids. Hopefully, one day we'll watch a sunset together," he said. Paul denied involvement and even criticized the media, emailing one journalist, "I've never seen more one-sided reporting." Robin is the least credible source. She was uninvolved in Rideout family affairs for 2 decades and stood to benefit from Craig's death. She is now the sole heir and insurance agent. Your failure to dig deeper makes you complicit in the sham. Dark questions about Paul's past. Not long after new whispers emerged, reporters learned that investigators had quietly re-examined the death of Paul's wife, Jennifer Tucci, who had passed in 2014 from liver disease. Experts questioned whether her symptoms could have been caused by slow poisoning, mimicking cirrhosis. Though the district attorney declined to reopen the case, and the medical examiner stood by the original ruling, suspicions about Paul lingered. Colin speaks out from prison. Colin Rideout gave his own interview, directing his fury at Laura. "What angered me most was her refusal to take responsibility. She always said, 'I'm sorry this is happening.' No. She did this. She set me up. Ask anyone. I'm not impulsive. That murder was premeditated, deliberate, calculated. My only role was cleaning up blood. I thought maybe there had been an accident. Nothing more." Supporters even launched a Free Colin Rideout campaign, arguing he had been scapegoated. Laura's appeal. When Laura filed her appeal, she shifted all blame onto her sons. Her attorney argued, "This was not the plan of a rational, Adult, it looks more like the impulsive violence of sons trying to protect their siblings from an abusive father, followed by a sloppy cover-up. It was a stunning reversal. The same mother who had orchestrated events now distancing herself completely from her children. Epilogue. The Rideout family. Laura Rideout's appeal was ultimately denied her son Alex. Rideout, who had been convicted of tampering with evidence but not murder, was eventually released from prison, unlike his brother Colin. Alex's sentence was short, and he was soon free. The youngest Rideout children were placed with relatives. In the Midwest, life moved forward. Though fractured, Julia graduated high school, Elizabeth went off to college, Andrew enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. The case left scars that would never fully heal. Craig's mother, Agnes, stayed in contact with Andrew, but admitted that most of the family ties had been destroyed. So much has happened, everything else is just too fractured. She said. Robin agreed, still haunted by the senselessness of it all. It's beyond my comprehension that they thought this was the only way out. The ends never justified the means by all accounts. Craig was a devoted father, a family man whose life was centered on those he loved. His murder was not only brutal but also deeply ironic. The very man who had given so much of himself to his family and community was betrayed from within. Robin and her family worked to honor his legacy, carrying themselves with the same grace, dignity, and kindness he had embodied theirs. Nothing we can do to bring my brother back, Robin said, but I hope he will be remembered as the kind, loving man he truly was. Story 4. The Faria Case. Our next story takes us to Northeast Phoenix, Arizona. January 16, 1997. Police burst into the home of Scott and Yamala Faria, shouting for Scott to get on the ground. Confused, Scott asked why officers were in his house. They repeated their commands, demanding to see his hands. When asked if anyone else was inside, Scott calmly said his wife and 2 children were upstairs. That answer struck the officers as strange, because in the backyard, they had already found something that didn't match his calm tone. At all, the couple's children, ages 12 and 15, were safe in their beds, unaware of the nightmare that had just unfolded. As one of them would later recall, I went to bed as a 12-year-old kid with a happy life. I woke up to a police officer telling me my mother was dead. Scott and Yamaleskat Faria was the eldest of 5. Raised in a middle-class Catholic family, he was described as introverted, studious, and deeply affected by the tension and violence he had witnessed in his parents' marriage and high school English class. Scott met Yamala, who friends called Yama. She was bright, artistic, and popular, with a quiet charm. They dated through college, and despite some struggles with faith and differences in values, the romance endured. Scott eventually converted to Mormonism, while Yama, raised Catholic like him, was initially resistant at one point. She even considered breaking off their engagement, but in the end, they married in 1976, in a ceremony presided over by a Mormon bishop. Over time, Yama reluctantly accepted the faith. She began attending classes, was baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and even participated in family religious life together. Scott and Yama built what seemed to be a stable life. They had 2 children, Megan, born in 1981, and Michael, born in 1984. They lived in Minnesota for a time before settling permanently in Phoenix. In 1987, Scott pursued a demanding career in electrical engineering at Motorola, while Yama worked at a preschool before becoming a full-time mother. Outwardly, they looked like the perfect suburban family. Scott even taught classes at their church and worked as a family counselor in his spare time, but behind the surface, tensions brewed. Yama often felt trapped and isolated, and by Scott's own later admission, he could be arrogant and self-centered still. By 1997, the couple was planning an exciting summer trip to Europe, and Scott was preparing to shift careers, aiming to become a science and math teacher. From the outside, the Farias looked like a family on the cusp of a bright new chapter. The night of January 16th, that night, Scott said he awoke around 3 a.m. after hearing noises outside, footsteps crunching on gravel near the bedroom window. Looking out, he saw nothing. He returned to bed but claimed he barely slept the following day he went through his normal routine, but it was stressful at work. He argued with his boss and feared his project would soon be scrapped. Putting jobs on the line, he returned home around 7 p.m. after dinner. He prepared for the religious education class he was set to teach the next morning. Yama asked him to take a look at the pool pump in the backyard around 9 p.m. He went outside with a flashlight, screwdriver, and pliers, but quickly gave up. Saying it was too dark to make any repairs, he placed the tools in the family Volvo parked in the garage, kissed Yama good night as she slept on the couch, and went to bed himself. I was really exhausted and just crashed. Scott later recalled it must have been between 9:30 and 10 o'clock, but next door, neighbors Greg Coons and his girlfriend Stephanie Reed had heard something strange that same night, moaning, crying, and a woman's voice pleading, "Please, no. Please don't." Greg looked over the fence. He saw Yama in the yard near the pool at first. He thought she was drunk, but then she rolled onto her back and stopped moving moments later. A light flicked on upstairs, inside the Faria home. Greg saw Scott the night of the murder from his upstairs window. Neighbor Greg Coons watched Scott Faria for several minutes. Scott stood at the sink, washing his hands. Then the light went off. Greg saw Scott walk through the kitchen and living room, before exiting through the side garage door, dressed in a white shirt and red sweatpants. Scott motioned for one of the family dogs to lie down. He then stood over his wife's body for several minutes before retreating back inside minutes later. Scott reemerged, wearing a single glove and pulling on the other. Greg kept his head low, afraid of being spotted. As he continued to watch, what he saw next was horrifying. Scott dragged his wife's body to the pool, rolled her into the water, and held her under at 10:57 p.m. Greg ran inside and dialed 911. "There's a man holding his wife underwater in the pool next door," he told the dispatcher. "He's killing her." Police had never been called to the Faria home before, but that night, multiple officers from the Phoenix Police Department rushed to the scene. When they arrived, they found 41-year-old Yama Faria floating lifelessly in the pool. Blood surrounded her. Officer Steven Stanowitz pulled her from the water, but it was already too late. "I've never seen a shark attack in person," Officer Joel Tranner later said, but this looked like one. As officers scanned the property, they noticed movement inside the house with weapons drawn. They entered carefully. Coming down the stairs was Scott Faria. His hands shook as officers ordered him to the ground. They noticed blood on his ear and tricep, and a fresh bandage on his finger. He was breathing heavily, struggling to stay calm. Scott was immediately taken into custody. Outside, he sat in the back of a police car, overhearing officers discuss the scene. He later recalled, "It was obvious to me my wife had either been badly hurt or killed." Meanwhile, police woke the couple's children in the middle of the night. They were told the devastating news. Their mother was dead. The interrogation at 1:53 a.m. on January 17, 1997. Scott was brought to the station for questioning. Detective John Norman led the interrogation from the start. Scott denied remembering anything. "The first thing I remember was an officer telling me to put my hands up," he insisted, when detectives explained that his neighbor had witnessed him push his wife underwater. Scott appeared stunned. "You've got to be kidding me. I don't remember doing that," he said. Detectives weren't buying it. Scott had blood on his neck and ear, but none on the clothes he had been arrested in. Asked about the bandage on his finger, he claimed he had no idea how the injury happened. Detective Norman was blunt. "The only thing I believe about your story is that your name is Scott Faria." The evidence investigators searched the property and uncovered a disturbing scene. Flashlight left pointed at the pool pump. Decorative stones from the pool area, one of them blood-stained, found inside the house in the garage. A family Volvo with bloodied clothes hanging out of the trunk. Inside the trunk, they found a plastic container filled with bloody jeans, an undershirt, socks, and a hunting knife coated in blood. Nearby was a black plastic bag containing boots and gloves, also heavily stained. The autopsy revealed Yamala had endured a savage attack. She suffered 44 stab wounds, 12 defensive injuries to her hands, multiple stab wounds to her chest, stomach, back, and neck. At least 5 wounds were 4 inches deep, 1 piercing her heart, and 3 puncturing her lungs on top of the stabbing. Water was found in her lungs, confirming she was alive when she was held under the pool. This was not an accident, it was overkill. The children's testimony the next day. Detectives interviewed the couple's 2 children. Both said the evening had been ordinary. Their mother had been reading and watching TV before bed. They had heard no arguments, no fighting, no signs of trouble. But now, their world was shattered. Their father stood accused of brutally murdering their mother. The charges: Scott Faria was charged with first-degree murder at first. His legal team considered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, but as preparations for trial began, that strategy shifted. During pre-trial interviews, Greg Coons retold what he saw. According to Scott's mother, Lois, Greg emphasized Scott's deliberate, calm movements that night, a detail that would prove devastating in front of a jury. I remember him saying Scott looked flat, like unemotional. Lois recalled the sleepwalking defense. Greg Coons, the neighbor who witnessed the killing, told investigators that Scott's movements seemed flat, almost robotic expression, like a robot. He said that's exactly how he looked. Greg thought Scott may have noticed him watching that night, but Scott never said a word. When Scott's mother, Lois, learned this, she suggested something unusual to his attorney. Scott had a history of sleepwalking, especially when under stress. She claimed her son may have killed his wife while in such a state. It was a shocking strategy, but not unprecedented across the world. There had been fewer than 30 known murder trials where sleepwalking was used as a defense. In one of the most famous cases, a man in Toronto had been acquitted after driving to his in-laws' home, attacking his father-in-law, and killing his mother-in-law, all while allegedly sleepwalking. But for Scott's defense to succeed, the jury would need to believe that he stabbed his wife 44 times, dragged her body to the pool, held her underwater, made multiple trips to the garage to stash bloody clothes and the murder weapon, recognized the family dog, and calmly signaled for it to lie down, all while unconscious and unaware of his actions. The question was obvious. Could this really happen? A history of sleepwalking. Lois recalled multiple strange incidents from Scott's childhood. At midnight, he would sometimes come downstairs fully dressed for school. At other times, he wandered the house naked with no memory. The next morning, his sister, Laura, remembered one frightening episode when Scott was 20 years old. He was sleepwalking toward the back door, and when she tried to stop him, he grabbed her shoulders and threw her aside. He looked so angry, almost demonic. She recalled, "I've never seen him look like that before or since." Scott himself claimed he had no recollection of these events. Sleep expert Dr. Richard Bootson explained that violent behavior during sleepwalking is extremely rare, but not impossible. There had been isolated cases of aggression, or even homicide, linked to parasomnia. So, Scott doubted the theory at first. "Inside, I thought it was BS, pure BS. He later admitted, "I thought my brain had thrown a rod. I figured I was headed for the state hospital or prison for life." Still, he acknowledged something darker. "Sometimes I wonder what kind of Jekyll and Hyde I am. There's no way I could hurt Yarm. I didn't know something like that could even exist inside me." Why the knife? Critics of the defense asked the obvious. If Scott was sleepwalking, why did he have the knife? Laura, his sister, speculated that he had intended to fix the broken pool pump days after Yarmila's death. The pump was found freshly gouged. Perhaps, she argued, Scott had grabbed the hunting knife instead of a screwdriver while in a sleepwalking state. If true, then when Yarmila tried to intervene, he may have attacked her without knowing what he was doing. Patterns of sleep. Scott's sleep habits were irregular. He often survived on just 3 hours a night, 4 days, before suddenly crashing and sleeping for 9 hours straight on the night of the murder. Scott said it had been one of those crash nights. "I just hit the bed and went out cold," he explained, before trial. Psychologist Dr. Janet Tapman evaluated him. Scott recalled waking up on the sofa, or even on the floor, with no idea how he got there. He admitted that on one occasion, his wife told him he had grabbed her arm in his sleep, something he had brushed off until his arrest. The sleep lab. Scott spent 4 nights in a sleep laboratory, hooked up to monitors recording his brain waves. The results revealed hypersynchronous delta waves, a pattern sometimes associated with sleepwalking, but prosecutors weren't convinced. They brought in Dr. Mark Pressman, another expert in parasomnia. He dismissed the findings as insignificant, pointing out that similar results could appear in people with sleep apnea. Most damaging, Dr. Pressman argued, was Scott's behavior on the night of the murder. Sleepwalkers often cannot distinguish between day and night. Yet Scott had clearly recognized it was dark. He had dressed himself, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped into the cold. That, Pressman said, suggested awareness, not unconscious wandering. Public scrutiny, as he awaited trial. Scott gave a television interview. He admitted the evidence against him was overwhelming. I have to accept that the neighbor saw me do it, the physical act, at least, but he remained adamant. If he had killed his wife, it must have been in a state he could not control, or even remembered. The trial began. Scott Fellator insisted. Would I have consciously, or intentionally, killed her? Absolutely not. His children were also questioned in pre-trial interviews. After you went to bed at 9 o'clock, what's the next thing you remember? One was asked. Waking up around 1:30, a police officer came and woke me up. Another chilling question followed. Michael, are you aware that if your father is convicted of first-degree murder, the prosecutor could ask for the death penalty? Have you prepared for that possibility? Michael hesitated. Not really. By June 1999, Scott Fellata stood trial. The case had already captured national attention. Live news broadcasts framed it as a legal showdown unlike any other. Prosecutor Juan Martinez, a fierce litigator with an undefeated record in murder trials, led the state's case. Martinez argued that Scott was fully conscious when he murdered his wife, Yarmila. He laid out the prosecution's theory. Scott coaxed Yarmila into the backyard, stabbed her repeatedly, then went inside to clean up. He changed clothes, hid the bloody garments and knife in the trunk of his Volvo, returned to the yard, calmed the dog, and realizing Yarmila was still alive, drowned her in the pool before returning to bed, as though nothing had happened to Martinez. It was deliberate, calculated, cold-blooded defense strategy. Scott's lawyer countered with a single explanation: sleepwalking at the time this tragedy occurred. Scott's mind was unconscious. His brain was in a sleepwalking state. This was a senseless act. There is no motive. He loved Yarmila more than anything in the world. The defense conceded that Scott had committed the physical act, but argued he had no intention of killing. Forensic evidence. One of the most crucial testimonies came from Dr. Philip Keene, the chief medical examiner. He described Yarmila's horrific injuries in detail. The prosecution argued that Scott had pinned her with his left arm, covering her mouth to silence her screams, while stabbing with his right hand. Then came the state's star witness, neighbor Greg Coons. He told jurors what he had seen that night. I saw someone lying on the ground near the pool equipment at first. I thought she was drunk. Then I saw Scott. He walked into the house. The next thing I saw, he came back into the living room, rubbing his hands. Later, I watched him kneel behind her and push her into the water. His testimony painted a devastating image, one of intent and follow-through, not unconscious wanderings. On trial, but the defense struck back with science. They brought in renowned sleep experts, Dr. Rosalind Cartwright and Dr. Roger Brotendar. Cartwright was blunt. It's my opinion he was sleepwalking. A sleepwalker doesn't stage a crime scene. He wouldn't leave bloody clothes in the trunk of a car he was going to drive. He wouldn't leave a pool filled with blood. None of this makes sense if he was awake and calculating. She explained that sleepwalkers are often confused, convinced something terrible is happening, and may lash out violently in self-defense at her. Bratton added that while Scott's behavior was unusual, the stabbing, the drowning, the multiple tasks, it wasn't impossible. He suggested Scott may have simply been responding to the dog jumping on him, rather than consciously quieting it. The defense even presented testimony from 2 of Scott's cellmates, who claimed they had witnessed him sleepwalking in jail, but under cross-examination, Dr. Bratton admitted he had never encountered a case where a sleepwalker stabbed someone, changed clothes, and hid evidence. The prosecution seized on this. They called their own expert, who argued Scott's actions, grabbing a flashlight, recognizing the dark, changing clothes, pointed to awareness, not sleepwalking. The scientific community itself was split, and the jury would have to decide, was Scott Philliter a grieving husband with a rare sleep disorder, or a cold, calculating killer? The expert showdown for prosecutors. The most powerful blow to Scott Philliter's defense came from Dr. Mark Pressman, a leading sleep specialist. He testified that Scott's behavior was far too complicated to be explained by sleepwalking. Pressman listed 66 distinct actions that Scott had performed that night, each one inconsistent with a person in a sleep state. Something as simple as touching the cold water in the pool, he argued, should have been enough to wake him up. To my knowledge, Pressman said, sleepwalkers may misplace items, but they don't hide them. They don't package bloody clothes neatly. They don't conceal evidence. He concluded that the actions carried out that night could only belong to someone fully awake and aware. Marriage. Under the microscope, the prosecution also tried to chip away at the image of a perfect marriage. One of Yarmila's friends testified that the couple had no major issues, but revealed one telling conversation. Yarmila had once woken to find Scott rifling through a wardrobe in the middle of the night, apparently asleep still. Prosecutors painted a different picture. They claimed Yarmila was unhappy with Mormonism, that she didn't want more children, while Scott did, and that when her body was found, she wasn't wearing her wedding ring. These details, they argued, hinted at hidden cracks in the marriage. The defense countered, these were minor disagreements, not enough to spark murder detectives' observations. Homicide detective John Norman, who had interrogated Scott, testified that Scott never cried or appeared visibly distraught after his wife's death, but even Norman admitted he struggled to find a motive. There was no history of abuse, no financial stress, no affairs, no substance misuse. By all outward appearances, the Philliter's life was stable, ordinary, even enviable. Scott himself told jurors, we hadn't screamed or shouted at each other in 15 years. I never would have thought of striking her, let alone killing her. A trial without a motive. Absence of motive baffled investigators and prosecutors alike. Sergeant Mike Torres of the Phoenix Police summed it up. Usually you can find a motive, you can figure out why, but here, we don't know, and maybe we never will. Court paperwork would later echo that conclusion. The question of motive remains unanswered. Scott testifies. When Scott himself took the stand, he stuck firmly to his story. He claimed to remember nothing of that night until police were pointing guns at him. He insisted he loved his wife, that they were happy, that there was no way he could have intentionally harmed her. I assumed I must have gone crazy, that something in my head broke. I don't know what I would do without her. The defense leaned heavily on science. Stress and sleep deprivation, they argued, can trigger violent episodes of sleepwalking. The behavior may appear illogical, even nonsensical, but it isn't voluntary, without awareness or intent. They reminded the jury that experts had testified to a documented connection between sleepwalking and acts of violence. They urged jurors to see Scott not as a killer, but as a man asleep, trapped in a nightmare. He could not control. The prosecution fired back. This wasn't sleepwalking. This was Juan. Martinez emphasized Scott's deliberate actions, changing clothes, hiding bloody items, controlling the dog, pushing his wife under water. He recognized his dog and told it to lie down, yet he couldn't recognize his wife. He's making it up to Martinez. The defense's story was just that, a story, and the truth was far simpler. Scott Philliter killed his wife and tried to cover it up. The verdict after a month-long trial. It was finally time for the jury to decide. They weighed the testimony of experts, the neighbor's eyewitness account, the evidence from the garage, the lack of motive, and Scott's own insistence that he remembered nothing when the jury returned. Their decision was unanimous. The foreperson read aloud, "We, the jury, in the above entitled action, upon our oaths, do find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree. Scott Felliter, the man who claimed he was asleep, was now legally branded a killer. Sentencing and aftermath. This was a terrible death, and we are satisfied we proved the defendant committed premeditated murder. The prosecutor told reporters after the trial. Jurors later explained how they reached their decision. One pointed to the hunting knife Scott used, calling it a weapon designed only for killing. Another juror admitted they wrestled with doubt, saying, "I think he could have been sleepwalking when he stabbed his wife. The possibility exists, but when he dragged her body, I think he woke up. He saw what he had done and panicked." Scott, meanwhile, was stunned by the verdict. "Never in my wildest dreams did I think anyone would believe I premeditated and planned to murder my wife. I can't understand how they came to that determination. A first-degree, guilty verdict. I wasn't expecting that." With guilt decided, the next question was sentencing. The death penalty was on the table. Character witnesses, including Scott's children, pleaded for mercy. They begged the court to spare their father's life, and even Yarmila's mother added her voice, asking that the state not pursue execution. In the end, the judge agreed. Scott Felliter was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He showed no visible reaction as the sentence was read. His defense attorney said the outcome wasn't surprising but confirmed they would appeal despite the gruesome evidence and the guilty verdict. Scott's children stood by him. "He's still my dad, and I hope to always have that relationship with him, whether he's in prison or out." His son Michael said the case shocked the nation, not only because of the brutality of Yarmila's death, but because of Scott's bizarre claim that he had been asleep the entire time. Years later, speaking from prison, Scott reflected on the tragedy. "I think about what she must have gone through that night, the pain, the terror. I can't even fathom it. I believe she would be more forgiving of me than I am of myself." When asked what he thought about people who refused to believe his story, including the jurors who convicted him, he said, "I know it sounds impossible that someone could stab the woman they love 44 times and then drown her, all while sleepwalking, but, however unbelievable it seems, it's the truth to this day." The case remains one of the most debated in Arizona history, a chilling reminder of how fragile the line between reality and nightmare can be. What everyone agrees on, however, is how deeply loved Yarmila was, a devoted wife, a caring mother, and a woman who gave her heart freely to those around her. Story 5. Fargo, North Dakota, 2009. The next case takes us to Fargo, North Dakota, where 49 Dr. Philip Gattuso lived. Philip's older brother, Roy, described him as a big softy, gentle, polite, and always willing to listen. Patients at his dental practice adored him, praising his warm smile and calm presence that made even the most anxious visits easier. After earning a degree in biological sciences in Louisiana, Philip found his calling in dentistry. He married young and had 2 sons, Philip Jr. and Joseph, but the marriage ended in divorce. Eventually, he relocated to Oklahoma City to pursue additional training, hoping to run his own practice. Someday it was there he met Valerie, a music-loving waitress with a passion for jazz. Their connection was instant. They shared a love of cooking, traveling, and music. By 2001, they were married. 2 years later, Philip's career was thriving. He achieved his dream of owning a practice, and by 2003, he and Valerie had settled into a condo on South University Drive in Fargo. Soon after, they welcomed their daughter, Kennedy, but not long after Kennedy's birth, Valerie began to suffer serious heart problems. Doctors discovered she needed surgery to repair a mitral valve. The operation, however, went horribly wrong. Complications forced Valerie into a medically induced coma for 2 months. She spent a total of 9 months in the hospital, battling organ failure, infections, and multiple strokes. The ordeal tore at the family. Valerie's parents, Jean and Sharon, wanted her to remain in Oklahoma, where specialists were available and where they could care for her. Philip, after his own research, believed the local hospital offered her the best chance at a heart transplant. After long debates, Valerie and baby Kennedy moved in with her parents in Oklahoma, while Philip stayed in Fargo to keep working and pay mounting medical bills. It broke his heart to be apart from them, but he wanted to provide and believed this was the best way to secure Valerie's future despite the distance. Philip did everything he could to support Valerie. He juggled his dental practice with frequent trips, and he called daily to check in. Friends said he was exhausted, but determined. He truly believed that if anyone could pull through, it was Valerie. But the months dragged on, and the toll became unbearable. Valerie's condition worsened, despite the doctor's efforts. Her body continued to fail tragically. She passed away in 2007. Kennedy was just 4 years old. Philip was devastated. He had lost the woman he called the love of his life, and now he was a single father raising a young daughter. Friends and family described how he threw himself into caring for Kennedy. She became his anchor, the reason he kept going. Roy, his brother, remembered. Phil was heartbroken, but Kennedy gave him purpose. He adored that little girl and would do anything for her life. Slowly began to stabilize. Philip was admired in Fargo, not just as a skilled dentist, but as a loving father who rarely missed Kennedy's school events. Patients and neighbors alike noticed how protective he was of her, but beneath the surface, there were tensions simmering between Philip and Valerie's family. Her parents, Jean and Sharon, had grown very close to Kennedy during Valerie's illness. They believed they should play a larger role in her upbringing, but Philip, wanting to shield his daughter from further instability, often resisted those disagreements created much so that friends later recalled hearing Philip expressed frustration. He didn't want conflict, but he also didn't want anyone interfering in how he raised Kennedy. By 2009, 2 years after Valerie's death, Philip seemed to be moving forward. His practice was flourishing, and he was described as a doting, full-time dad on the outside. Everything looked stable, even hopeful, but no one could have predicted what was about to happen next, an event that would shake the Fargo community to its core and leave Kennedy without either parent. The day everything changed. September 2009, Fargo, North Dakota. By all accounts, it began as a normal Monday morning for 49 dentist Dr. Philip Gattuso. He dropped Kennedy, now 5 years old, off at daycare and headed to his office. As he had countless times before, later that day, Kennedy's daycare became concerned when Philip failed to return to pick her up. This was highly unusual. He was known for being punctual, especially when it came to his daughter's staff called his office, but there was no answer. Finally, a relative was contacted to check on him when police entered Philip's condominium on South University Drive. They discovered a gruesome scene. He had been bludgeoned to death inside his own home. Blood covered the living room. There was no sign of forced entry, but investigators quickly determined it was a brutal homicide. Kennedy, thankfully, had not been home at the time, but the reality was chilling. The little girl had just lost her father in the most violent way imaginable. Shockwaves in Fargo. The murder stunned the Fargo community. Dr. Gattuso was beloved by his patients and respected by peers. He had no known enemies, no history of crime, and no signs of living a risky lifestyle. Phil was one of the nicest guys you'd ever meet. One patient recalled the kind of man who made you feel comfortable the second you walked in the room. I couldn't imagine anyone wanting to hurt him. But detectives quickly realized this was no random attack. The killer hadn't stolen valuables, and the assault was personal, deliberate, and rage-filled. Someone had targeted Philip, specifically looking at family tensions. Naturally, investigators began by examining the most obvious tension in Philip's life: his strained relationship with Valerie's parents. Jean and Sharon Kirkpatrick, the Kirks, had been devastated by the loss of their daughter and were deeply attached to their granddaughter, Kennedy. But Philip's insistence on being the primary decision-maker for Kennedy often left them feeling shut out. Detectives learned that the disagreement had grown bitter at times. Custody concerns loomed in the background. Was it possible that this family conflict had escalated into something much darker? The answer would come soon, and it was even more shocking than anyone could have imagined. The break in the case. At first, Police had little to work with. There were no signs of forced entry, no burglary, and no obvious suspects, but detectives began carefully retracing Philip's final days, interviewing family, friends, and neighbors within days. Investigators zeroed in on something highly suspicious. A young man named David D.J. Runk, 21 years old, who had been seen around the area. Runk was already known to police, a troubled young man with a history of reckless behavior. His name came up after witnesses recalled seeing an unfamiliar car parked near Philip's condo. That car was eventually traced back to Runk. Detectives brought him in for questioning. The confession at first, Runk denied everything, but under mounting pressure, his story began to unravel. Eventually, he admitted to being involved in the crime, but not alone. He revealed a chilling detail. He hadn't acted on his own. He had been hired to kill Philip Katuzawand, the person behind the plan. None other than Gene Kirkpatrick, Philip's father-in-law. Murder for hire scheme. According to Runk, Gene Kirkpatrick approached him with an offer: kill his son-in-law in exchange for $20,000. Gene allegedly told him that Philip was unfit to raise Kennedy, and that the only way to protect his granddaughter was to get rid of him. The murder was carefully plotted. Runk was given details of Philip's routine, his home address, and the assurance that the job would be paid for once it was done. That September morning, Runk entered the condo, confronted Philip, and beat him to death with a hammer-like object. It was savage, brutal, and intentional. Police confront Gene Kirkpatrick. When investigators brought this information to Gene, the 63-year-old Oklahoma man didn't deny his involvement for long. Shockingly, he admitted he had arranged the murder, but, in his version, he insisted that he hadn't wanted Philip dead for selfish reasons. Instead, he claimed he was thinking of his granddaughter, Kennedy. He feared she would have an unstable life in Philip's care, and in his twisted reasoning, removing Philip would secure her future. To many, this explanation sounded less like concern and more like obsession. Community reaction. The news sent shockwaves through Fargo and beyond. The idea that a grandfather could orchestrate the murder of his granddaughter's only surviving parent was almost too much to comprehend. Friends of Philip were horrified. Phil adored Kennedy. Everything he did was for her. To think someone thought they were doing her a favor by killing him, it's sickening. Even those who knew Gene were stunned. He was described as quiet, religious, and seemingly devoted to his family, yet behind that exterior, he had plotted one of the most heartless crimes imaginable. Despite his heartbreak after Valerie's passing, Philip focused entirely on raising Kennedy, who was only 3 at the time. Friends recalled that while he was devastated inside, he shielded Kennedy from his pain. He grieved privately, never allowing her to see him cry. To her, life seemed unchanged, filled with coloring and games before breakfast, evenings with dinner and movies, and a father who never let her feel his despair. By the fall of 2009, Philip was making adjustments to spend more time at home with Kennedy. He had begun putting steps in place to reduce his hours at the dental practice, and was even planning to hand over certain responsibilities to others. On the morning of October 26, 2009, he dropped Kennedy off at daycare as usual at 8:30 a.m. before returning home for a 10:30 conference call. But that call never happened. Nearly 12 hours later, at just after 7 p.m., daycare staff became alarmed when Philip had not arrived to collect Kennedy. They called Julie Willett, a close friend of both Philip and Valerie. Julie, who along with her husband had often stepped in to support the family, was listed as an emergency contact. The daycare explained that Philip could not be reached, and Kennedy was still waiting. Julie immediately knew something was wrong, fearing he might have collapsed at home. Julie phoned around for help before heading to his condo with one of Philip's neighbors. When they arrived, all the doors and windows were locked. The neighbor climbed the fence and looked through the garage door. Philip's beloved silver Porsche was missing. They forced their way inside. The sight was disturbing. The condo had been completely ransacked, drawers pulled out, photo frames knocked from walls, furniture overturned, shattered glass on the floor. Whoever had been there had taken their time. Julie moved cautiously, Toward the master bedroom there, she found her worst fear realized. Philip was lying on the floor, his head surrounded by blood. She later described the moment as an out-of-body experience. She could see herself dialing 911, but couldn't recall what she said or did afterwards. Soon, the house was swarming with police, paramedics, and reporters. Kennedy stayed with Julie that night. Unaware of what had truly happened, the Willets tried to make it feel like a fun sleepover. But Kennedy repeatedly asked when her daddy was coming to get her at 3 a.m. Exhausted, she finally fell asleep. Detectives notified Philip's relatives, most of whom lived out of state and couldn't get to Fargo quickly. Calls were also made to Jean and Sharon Kirkpatrick, Valerie's parents. They were devastated by the news. Losing their daughter had been unbearable now. Just months later, their granddaughter was left without a mother or father. They began preparing for the nearly 900-mile drive to collect Kennedy and bring her back to Oklahoma. At first glance, investigators believed robbery was the motive. Philip's Porsche was gone, along with televisions, laptops, cameras, DVD players, and cash, as one officer put it. If it was electronic or worth money, it was taken. The autopsy revealed Philip had been beaten to death. He had suffered at least 10 blows to the head with a blunt, circular object, a hammer. The force was so extreme that the medical examiner compared the condition of his skull to shattered glass. What puzzled investigators was the timing. Philip never made his 10:30 a.m. call, meaning he was killed sometime between 8:45 and 10:30 a.m. broad daylight, while neighbors were heading to work or dropping off children. It was a reckless risk for a burglar. Equally strange, there were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no smashed windows. Whoever entered either had a key or had been let in willingly. Once inside, the killers had taken their time. This wasn't a quick break-in, it was a brutal attack, followed by hours spent looting the house. To detectives, it didn't feel like a random robbery at all. It felt personal. Jean and Sharon Kirkpatrick, along with their daughter Reagan, soon arrived in Fargo to pick up Kennedy. Sharon phoned Julie Willett, asking her to bring Kennedy to a restaurant so they could meet. Julie, however, reminded them that this was still an active murder investigation and suggested it was better for everyone to remain nearby. She invited them over for lunch instead. The Kirkpatricks seemed so overwhelmed that they didn't ask many questions, didn't seem ready for any answers. Police eventually allowed the Kirkpatricks to take Kennedy back to Oklahoma, granting Reagan's family temporary custody before leaving. Valerie's father, Gene, spoke with investigators. He couldn't think of anyone who would want to harm Philip, but mentioned one detail. Philip enjoyed poker and regularly went to the casino. I'm not going to use the word gambling, Gene explained, but I think he went every Saturday. Gene worried perhaps Philip owed money to the wrong person. Detectives checked with casino regulars. Many knew Philip well and were stunned to hear about his murder, but none recalled him owing debts. In fact, most described him as a sharp, successful player who rarely lost. The gambling theory quickly fizzled out with no witnesses in neighboring condos. Investigators turned to surveillance cameras around the area, hoping to spot either Philip's missing Porsche or suspicious activity across from Philip's condo. A bowling alley provided a promising lead. The owner reviewed his cameras with detectives at 7:30 a.m., just an hour before Philip was killed. A pickup truck towing a trailer pulled into the bowling alley parking lot. It circled, parked facing the road, and sat there. The business didn't open until 11 a.m., and the only other cars belonged to early staff members. The truck seemed out of place. 16 minutes later, at 7:46 a.m., its headlights flashed, and a man stepped out, walking in the direction of Philip's condo. Another camera across the street captured fragments of the same figure, legs moving quickly behind buildings headed toward Philip's residence. By 10:46 a.m., a silver Porsche, matching Philip's, was seen leaving the area. Investigators knew by then Philip was already dead, meaning whoever was driving the Porsche was his killer. Moments later, cameras recorded the pickup with its trailer following the Porsche into a nearby apartment lot at 11:30 a.m. Both the truck and trailer now carrying the Porsche left. Together, a resident in the apartments recalled seeing the strange scene that morning from her window around 11 a.m. She spotted a dark pickup towing a silver Porsche. Curious, she stepped outside under the pretense of taking trash to the bins. She described the man attaching the Porsche as a white male, middle-aged, scruffy beard, baseball cap pulled low. Nice car. She said, "Oh, it's not mine," the man muttered. Without looking at her, "I'm just moving it for a guy who bought it on eBay." His clipped tone and avoidance of eye contact struck her as suspicious. Detectives considered her account a breakthrough video enhancement, and her description were released publicly, sparking a wave of tips. One particularly valuable lead came from a rest stop about 20 minutes away. A man there told police he had seen the same truck and trailer. The Porsche on the trailer was covered, but curious, he peeked under the tarp and spotted the silver car when he complimented the driver on it. The man repeated the eBay story. What stuck out most wasn't just the Porsche. It was the driver's appearance. The witness recalled a red stain smeared across his trousers, though he hadn't thought much of it at the time, luckily. The rest stop's surveillance cameras were high quality. They confirmed the timeline down to the minute. Footage showed the suspect walk into the building carrying a black plastic bag at one point. He glanced directly at the camera, giving detectives their first clear look at the killer's face, roughly 5 minutes after entering the rest stop. The suspect reappeared on camera, this time wearing fresh jeans and a clean t-shirt. The change of clothes was suspicious, especially given what the earlier witness had described as a red stain on his trousers. Exterior cameras then captured the truck and trailer, with Philip's Porsche secured on the back, driving away for the first time. Investigators could make out part of a license plate. Digital enhancements confirmed it was from Oklahoma, and the vehicle had been rented on October 31st, just 5 days after Philip's murder. Police announced an arrest. The truck was linked to Michael Nikiter, a career criminal with a troubling history. His record included accusations of rape, kidnapping, home invasions, and armed robbery years earlier. He had pleaded guilty to 1 count of kidnapping and 9 counts of armed robbery. In exchange for a 20-year sentence, he served 8 years before being released in 2002. Now, he worked odd jobs as a handyman at first. Philip's friends and family drew a blank. No one knew the name, and no connection to Philip seemed to exist. That changed when officers searched a storage unit Michael had rented inside. They discovered Philip's stolen Porsche within it. A hammer still carried traces of Philip's blood and hair. Many of the stolen items from the condo were also recovered. Michael himself stayed silent in custody, but when detectives spoke to his mother, the truth began to surface. Michael wasn't just a random criminal. He was the handyman for Gene Kirkpatrick, Valerie's father, and Philip's father-in-law. Case instantly shifted focus. Investigators now suspected a murder-for-hire plot. On November 2nd, Gene was brought in for questioning. Detectives confronted him with their theory that he had orchestrated the killing of his son-in-law. Whispers had already circulated that Gene blamed Philip for Valerie's death, and that he resented the idea of Kennedy being raised by him. Gene had wanted full custody, and Philip's refusal reportedly deepened their rift. Initially, Gene downplayed his involvement, describing conversations with Michael as nothing more than locker room talk. He admitted he had vented, even said he wanted Philip dead, but insisted he never believed Michael would act on it. But before long, he began to backtrack. "I guess I gave him the green light." Gene admitted everything was his suggestion, but I was right there with him. The weight of what he had done seemed to hit him. He worried aloud about Kennedy. "She's going to say, 'My grandfather killed my daddy,'" he said at the end of the interview. His fear was clear. "Am I going to jail right away? It scares me." The consequences. Police, however, already had solid evidence. Gene had paid Michael $3,000 in cash during a meeting in a McDonald's parking lot. He had promised another $10,000 after the job, plus permission to take whatever he wanted from Philip's home. Investigators even found he had sent Michael video footage of Philip's condo and his Porsche to many who knew him. Gene's arrest was shocking. He had long been seen as a devoted family man, devastated by illness and death, yet those closest to Philip painted a different picture. Valerie's sister described Philip as cold and narcissistic, but others rejected this entirely. Friends and colleagues remembered Philip as warm, generous, and deeply devoted to Kennedy. His brother Roy said Philip's death was rooted in selfishness, revenge, and obsession. Roy recalled how Gene repeatedly pressured Philip to promise custody of Kennedy. If Valerie passed away, Philip refused every time, and in private conversations, admitted to his brother that Gene's threats had left him worried about his own safety now. Those fears had become reality. Gene Kirkpatrick was formally charged with conspiracy to commit murder, while Michael Nikiter faced first-degree murder and burglary charges. Police described Gene's identification as a suspect as the result of a combination of investigative leads, physical evidence, and testimony, all pointing to one conclusion. He had conspired to kill his own son-in-law. Shockwaves rippled through Oklahoma. Eyewitness news broke the story to the Kirkpatrick's housekeeper, who was stunned. "I just can't believe it," she said when reporters knocked on the Kirkpatrick home. No one answered. Investigators revealed the chilling motive. Gene Kirkpatrick had hired a hitman to eliminate his son-in-law in the middle of a bitter custody battle. He didn't want Kennedy raised by Philip, and almost immediately after the murder, Gene and Sharon drove north to North Dakota to collect their granddaughter. On the way, Sharon phoned their housekeeper. She said they wouldn't be home because their son-in-law had been in an accident. The Kirkpatricks told their housekeeper they needed to travel north, immediately saying their son-in-law had been in an accident. They insisted they had to be there for their granddaughter. The housekeeper and a neighbor, both tenants of the Kirkpatricks, described the family as kind and generous people to them. The allegations seemed unbelievable. Meanwhile, the investigation and legal process moved forward quickly. Michael Nikiter pleaded not guilty to all charges, as did Gene Kirkpatrick. Despite the seriousness of the accusations, Gene was able to post a staggering $1 million bond, loaned to him by a friend, and was released while awaiting trial on November 4th. Philip's funeral was held. Kennedy, too young to fully understand, was not permitted to attend, but Philip's first wife, Karen, and her mother, Catherine, were present, as were Philip and Karen's sons, extended family, and hundreds of community members who came to say goodbye. The battle for Kennedy's custody soon followed. A judge ruled that Regan Kirkpatrick, Valerie's sister, would have to give up temporary custody, awarding guardianship instead to Roy Gattuso, Philip's brother. For Roy, the decision brought relief and joy. Kennedy would grow up within her father's family, safe from the shadow of the Kirkpatricks back in Fargo. Michael Nikiter appeared in court to determine if his case would proceed to trial. Prosecutors pushed for further forensic testing, but his defense team resisted, arguing samples might be destroyed, limiting their ability to conduct independent analysis. The trial was set for August 10. Threne's trial date was still pending, though he remained free on bond just over a year after the murder. The courtroom finally heard Michael's defense. He denied killing Philip, claiming instead that he had been framed by Gene. According to him, he believed he was only picking up a Porsche Gene had purchased online. On the stand, Michael painted Gene as the mastermind, even describing how Gene had demanded the murder be carried out up close and personal. But Gene also testified, insisting that any talk of murder had been taken out of context. He dismissed it as mere venting, casual remarks that Michael had misinterpreted. The jury didn't buy it. After hearing from 30 witnesses and reviewing over 300 pieces of evidence, Michael Nikiter was found guilty of Philip's murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Then came Gene's turn. In July 2011, a North Dakota jury convicted him of conspiracy to commit murder. He, too, was sentenced to life without parole. Philip's brother Roy summed it up: "Michael was just the weapon. Gene was the man who really killed my brother." Reporters captured the moment Gene heard the verdict. "I'm surprised," he said quietly, still maintaining his denial. The judge, however, saw through Gene's facade. Your friends and family do not know the dark side of you, the dark side the jury saw, the dark side that conspired with Mr. Nicaider to send him 900 miles to Fargo to bludgeon Mr. Gattuso to death. All for your misguided ends. Kennedy, now at the heart of the tragedy, was later awarded nearly $10 million in damages in a wrongful death lawsuit against Jean. A permanent restraining order was issued, barring the Kirkpatricks from any contact with her. Regan Kirkpatrick, Valerie's sister, later said she would not interfere in Kennedy's life, but hoped that someday when Kennedy turned 18, she might seek out her mother's family. We'd love to know that she's doing well, that she's happy, and that she's had a good life. Kennedy, meanwhile, grew up surrounded by the love and protection of her father's family, shielded from the legacy of betrayal that had stolen both her parents. Kennedy still visits her grandfather in prison a few times each year. Despite everything, she continues to believe in his innocence. He doesn't have what it takes to take someone's life. She once said in 2016, more than 6 years after the conviction, a judge ruled that Philip's $37 million estate would be divided equally among his 3 children, Joseph, Philip Jr., and Kennedy. Not long after, Kennedy went to live with Philip's niece in the New Orleans area, where she grew up surrounded by extended family. Julie, the close family friend who had been there since the very beginning, still keeps in touch. She visits Kennedy every few years and is proud of the young woman she's becoming. She's doing really well, Julie said. She's grown into a beautiful young lady. This weekend marks 10 years since one of Fargo's most high-profile and haunting crimes, the brutal murder for hire of dentist Philip Gattuso, a case so senseless it left an entire community shaken. A 3-year-old girl lost both of her parents in the span of a single year. A loving father, devastated by the loss of his wife, had poured everything into raising his daughter, only to have his life violently taken away for what? It was a crime driven by obsession, revenge, and delusion, a murder that destroyed multiple families and left behind wounds that time will never fully heal. Even now, it raises more questions than answers as the rain falls softly and the night deepens. Thank you for joining me here on Crime Whisper. True crime reminds us not only of life's darkest mysteries, but of the fragile threads that bind us together. So let the rain guide you into rest. Until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night watch over you.